if you look at Job was a priest king because first he loses his offspring and his possessions, and that's the fruit of the land and the womb, which is what makes you a king. Those are the things that promised to Adam and promised to Abraham. If you don't have food, you don't have a personal future. If you don't have offspring, you don't have a cultural future. The sons of God are the other priest kings, and they're assembled together. And God chooses Job from the flock for sacrifice.
All I could see was this light coming in.
The Holy Spirit went. It blew into me.
I have never been the same since then.
That was it. I'm done.
I was born again.
Welcome to the Weird Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Samuel Delgado, and this is episode 82. I interview Michael Bull about the book of Job. So within that discussion, we get into the sons of God from chapters 1 and 38, I believe. And of course, that dovetails into the Nephilim and giants. He follows the sethite view, and he has a defense of that view that's beyond the scope of Genesis 6. So we talk about that for a good bit. And then we end the discussion by getting into Leviathan and Behemoth. And he takes the view that those are actual dinosaurs. But as you probably already saw the running time, we get into a lot more within the discussion as well. So if you've heard our last discussion, our last episode I did with Michael Bull, you know what you're in for. So get ready. You can break it up if you want to, but I know you're going to enjoy this episode. It was a good one. So with no further ado, let's get weird. Listen, I'm excited to have you back on. I gotta say, I was worried last time because of the length of the episode that no one would listen. But that's definitely not the case. I think your episode has already cracked the top 10 episodes, which I'm really excited about because it was it's honestly one of my favorite episodes I've done, if not maybe my favorite.
Oh, cool.
And I feel like honestly I could have kept going, but I kind of felt like I had to get it to a close because I didn't want to put out an absurdly long episode, but it didn't seem to deter the listeners. So anyway,
yeah. If you go longer than Joe Rogan, people start to feel a bit intimidated. Yeah. But we did a Joe Rogan length, 3 hours or whatever. So yeah. Also too, the good thing about podcasts is people can break it up as they need to. So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
it's true. And
well, it was fun. I'm a bit intimidated by today because this is probably something I might not know quite as well, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
And and I promised myself that I'm not going to say 100 times like I did in the last one. I was watching it a bit and I thought, oh my goodness, what a terrible habit. It's almost as bad as
I didn't notice it myself when I listened back.
Yeah.
But I know when
I'll try and avoid the filler.
Yeah. If people go back and listen, or if they've been listening for a while on my podcast, they know my first few episodes. I even had someone comment about the ums, but it took me probably 20 episodes before I could go from a million ums to a few hundred ums. There you go. I just did it.
That's fine. Yeah, as long as it's a work in progress and you're improving. It
happens. yeah, it happens. Anyway, so we're talking about Job today, which is, I read an article that you had on your site about it, and I thought, man, I got to have you on to talk about this because I've never heard too much, at least as far as the origin of the book. And who Job was. I've never really heard that take before, and I think it's one that's really fascinating. So, but I decided to go ahead and just talk about the entire book, and then really as more of a excursus, I guess. Perhaps we can touch the sons of God, which is a lot of times Job is used as a proof text for to support the angelic view. So we can get into that too. So welcome back to the show. Let's just jump in and talk about. I've heard of Job. Obviously, we know that Genesis took place prior, but I've heard that Job was the first book that was actually written in the canon. Do we know who wrote the book and when it was written?
I don't think it was the first book written. I think a lot of that is conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say it was written about the time. Well, if you look at if you identify who Job is, and I follow James Jordan's view on that. I think he's nailed it. That Job is an Edomite, so he's descended from Esau.
Hmm.
If you look at Genesis 36, it has a genealogy of Esau. I think it's 36, and it mentions a guy called Bel, who is Balaam. Balaam's a nickname that he's given in the book of Numbers to ridicule him because it means people eater.
Mm.
But and the same as, Belshazzar and a few others have names that, and Nimrod means rebel, I think. So Laban name means, Laban is an anagram of fool, Nabal, like Abigail's husband, Nabal.
Oh, wow.
So Laban, So some of these names might not be the names of the actual people, or God ordained that they would be given names that would label them. So Job is actually listed in Genesis 36 as being Balaam's successor. So he was an Edomite king, and that means that he's one of the tribal priest kings that were part of the way things were set up in the world after Noah. So after Noah, when it lists all the nations in Genesis 10, each tribe had its priest king, like Noah, who would not only offer sacrifices to God as a priest, but would also judge people as a king. And we notice that in Israel, those two roles were separated. Mm-hmm. God allowed you couldn't be a priest and a king. And that was to keep the sacrifices separate from political influence. And that is why when King Uzziah tried to offer incense, God struck him. Hang on a second. I'm getting my phone. I thought I turned my phone off. It's my other phone. Yeah, I've got two at the moment because I inherited one from one of my kids. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
So they have the same number. Anyway, yeah. So if you identify who Job is, and this means if he's an Edomite, then it's obviously in the time after Jacob and Esau. Mm-hmm. It's in the time after the book of Numbers, because Job is Balaam's successor. Mm-hmm. So Balaam was killed, and Job is a much better guy because he's a faithful priest king. He offers sacrifices, and so I think it was written about the time of the other wisdom literature, which is why that's where it's collected. I'm not really that familiar with the arguments for an earlier date, but I'd say some of it is due to modernist ideas of dating books. I disagree with the common idea that Revelation has a late date, sort of 96 or whatever. I disagree with that. Most of the New Testament was given late dates, but they're constantly revising it back earlier, and it was Jewish practice to write things down straight away. So I'd go with an earlier date on that. But with Job, I think I'd say maybe the events couldn't have taken place before what happened in the Book of Numbers, and I believe that Genesis was actually recorded in stages by the various generations. And then passed down through the lineage to Moses, who then passed it on. So I wouldn't say it's the oldest book. That's my position on that. Yeah, could be wrong, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I think too, people who hold to a late date of Genesis, they say, oh well, there was a polemic written after the Exodus, and it was to deal with sort of an argument against paganism. I'm like, no, sorry, this was actually historical. It wasn't just a story that God gave them to fight against it. It's the whole A&E stuff. I think you're undermining Scripture in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it could have been put together by Solomon. You know, it's not a simple book, and there's a lot of stuff in it that's implied rather than overt, and the book kind of invites you into the debate. It doesn't spoon feed you. You know, these guys are they're arguing things, and you're in a sense invited to take part in this discussion. And Genesis does that quite a bit too. If you read Genesis, a lot of the time it'll tell you what people did, but it won't reveal their motives. And you have to, and same in later books, say Samuel and Kings, where it'll say certain people did things, and you think, well, is this good or bad? For instance, Abraham lied to protect his wife. Was he doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Lot offered his daughters. Was he doing, and the New Testament calls him righteous. Was he doing the right thing or the wrong thing? And the whole thing with the book of Genesis is that it's all about outsmarting snakes and being more crafty than they are. So Abraham was being crafty, because if he said he was Sarah's brother, then he knew that Pharaoh would have had to negotiate with him for her to marry her. Pharaoh bypassed that anyway. So God blessed Abraham and cursed Pharaoh. So Abraham did the right thing. He was actually being wise, rescuing Sarah as Eve from the serpent. That's the idea. So that's another story. But anyway, so I think with Job as well, it's the same thing. Is God good? Is God? That was the question faced by Adam when challenged by the serpent. God is withholding something from you. Obviously, it's much more pronounced in Job because he's really suffering badly. He's lost everything, including his health. And the question is God good, or is it the fact that God is good and Job is bad? And then you get to the bit where Elihu comes in and says, "Well, Job, you're a righteous man," because it says at the start he's blameless, but you're defending yourself, and in a sense you're kind of incriminating God here. So Elihu comes in, and he wasn't mentioned at the start. He's like the young tongue comes in, and he says, "I just have to speak." And so he kind of sets him straight there. But so God is vindicated, but Job is also vindicated. But the whole thing is that as wisdom literature, it's designed to make us wise, the same way that God allowed the serpent into the garden to make Adam wise. Okay, Adam, you need to figure this out based on what I told you, and I didn't tell you everything. Based on what I told you, how are you going to deal with this? And in our lives, God throws us curveballs as well. In our culture, we have things that come into our culture to challenge the truth, and they're often very subtle, and they keep getting more subtle. For instance, Marxism pretends to be Christianity in the sense, or Christianity without Christ, in the sense that it wants equity for all, and it wants to deal with poverty and all this sort of stuff. But it's actually theft, and it's a deception. It's like Judas saying, we should give this money to the poor, but he had other motives. He was the first kind of socialist. So, but now we have neo-Marxism now, and people say, well, it's not Marxism because it's not the same. But the idea is that it's Satan will always kind of repackage things to fool us. Same as before the flood, his strategy was to destroy worship and the sacrifices, but after the flood, his strategy was to present a fake worship in the Tower of Babel. This was a new challenge, and so he's constantly upgrading. He has to. It's like levels in a game. You have to. The difficulty level gets harder and harder, but God is using history to train us in wisdom. So the wisdom literature, I believe, based on, even though there are elements of that in Genesis where it's all about outcrafting the serpent. And God is always craftier than the serpent, and he wants his sons to be crafty as well, in the sense like Jacob, God revealing to Rebecca that the younger son would serve the older son. And so she sees that Isaac's about to give the inheritance to make Esau the heir, but that's not what God said. So she has to act.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where her deceit is a godly deceit. The midwives in Exodus that lied to Pharaoh, and God blessed them.
Yeah.
So the idea of bearing false witness is about motive. If you're trying to destroy someone by lying about them, that's perjury. That's what's condemned in the 10 words, in the 10 commandments. But if you lie to protect the innocent, that seems to be quite okay.
Yeah.
God's all, and of course, God is not beyond deceit in a few places where, he shows himself crafty to the crafty. I'm not sure exactly how it's said, but it's if you think you're cunning, God will outsmart you. And that's what he does all the way through the Bible. So, I think that's with Job. It's all about, well, something's happening that we don't understand. It's not like Proverbs where it's just a bunch of very helpful statements about reality and about truth. And, if you work hard, you won't be poor. If you don't work hard, you'll be poor. And yet you look out in the world, and as sometimes there are people who are deceitful and they're doing really well, and things seem to be the reverse of what should be happening. It's a bit like what Rebecca saw. She looks at the world and sees, well, hang on, this isn't what God said. Another example is Noah, who said that Ham and, Canaan particularly, would be the slave because Ham had tried to steal he wanted his son to be the head of the household, basically steal the inheritance. I assumed that he thought Noah was dying. He was in a deep sleep because he'd had some wine, and he wanted, it was like getting a deathbed testament in a sense, to steal the inheritance from his brothers. And that's why we see that explains the nature of the curse of Noah upon Canaan. Mm-hmm. Then when you get to the book of Exodus, who's in slavery? The Egyptians were descended from Ham, and they're not the slaves, they're the slave masters, and the sons of Shem, the Hebrews, are the slaves. It's the opposite of what Noah said, that God said through Noah. And so this is where, if you're following the plot, you look at it and say, oh, okay, this is the opposite of what God had said would happen. Somebody needs to act. And that's what happens with God sending Moses into Egypt. Pharaoh was killing the children, the male infants, to reduce their numbers, and basically they would bring all the women, like stealing Sarah, bring the women in and marry them off to Egyptians, and that would end the line. That's the satanic strategy, to end the messianic line as well, to wipe Israel out by, intermarriage, which we'll get to a bit later. So the idea of calling the reader to judge is something that still confuses us a lot, because we expect the Bible to just be plain statements of truth. And yet Job is this debate going on where these guys are looking at the surface issues and saying, well, there has to be a reason here. And but that's where trust in God's character is the key. Satan said, to imply to Adam, God's not a good dad. He's withholding stuff from you. So just take it. God's stingy. Just take it. This is what he's promised. Just take it. When Joseph was tempted by Potiphar's wife, he says, how could I do this to my master? He's put me in charge of the whole household. He was being tempted to steal the entire household. In the same way, like if you wanted to be like Absalom slept with David's concubines to say, I'm the king now, I've taken my father's wives.
Yeah.
Okay. Reuben slept with one of Jacob's concubines, as if to say, well, I'm the firstborn, I should still be the heir.
Wow.
And then you got the guy in the Corinthian church who had his father's wife. It wasn't about sex. It was about, I am the heir. I am now taking my father's wife. I am the successor. So Joseph had been promised to be the heir by Jacob. He was the favorite son because the others had disqualified themselves. And so he was actually being tempted to take Potiphar's house. because he'd been robbed of what was promised to him by his brothers.
Wow.
And so he could rightly have said, well, those guys took what I was promised, so I'm going to steal in return from Potiphar, my master. And he rejected the temptation.
Wow.
Also, too, Potiphar's wife, it wasn't just a one night stand for her. She's well, if I can get him to do this and take the household, I can have him every night. So there's that as well. I prefer this guy. So it's all about stealing the inheritance, which is what Satan always wants to do. It's always about stealing the inheritance. If he can get God to kill Adam and Eve because they've sinned, then Satan owns the world in a sense.
Yeah.
So the inheritance is the key all the way through. Who's it? The messianic line, and God. It sometimes jumps tracks, as I think I mentioned last time, when you've got Perez and Zerah, and the line of Zerah gets killed off in Achan at Jericho, and then it jumps tracks and goes through Perez, and Rahab marries into that line.
Yeah.
So it's this really clever, and I think it was under Athaliah. I might have mentioned that once before as well, where the messianic line is down to one child. She's killed all her grandkids, but the nurse rescued one. Yeah. And when you look at the family tree, as far as I know, if that child had been killed, that would have been the end of the messianic line.
Yeah.
So it just takes one, just one. So I think Job it's a very long answer, I know, but the idea is, as we read it, we're called to judge, we're called to think, we're called to look at. It helps us to look at the events around us, which is what people talk. I think it's is it theodicy? The evil and sin in the world, is that the word?
Not sure.
Where that's the big question. Why is there evil in the world? Why does God allow suffering?
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot more going on in the book of Job than that.
Yeah.
It wasn't just God allowing Satan to make this man suffer just to highlight the fact that there is evil and suffering in the world. There's a lot more going on there, which we could talk about when you're ready.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I just want to, comment that I'm so much more attracted to that view and backdrop of Job. I've even recently heard, you're talking about some more extreme interpretations. One was that the entire book was completely allegorical, and you mentioned, post-exile, that it was written for, a certain purpose. I guess that's a similar viewpoint. But anchoring, I think the reason why I've heard it explained, this took place prior to Abraham, because within the book itself, we don't have any mention of Israel as a nation or anything like that. I think is the explanation I've always classically heard. You mentioned him having that role as priest king. Do we have any what's the internal evidence that he is functioning as priest king?
I think James Jordan has an article called "Was Job an Edomite King?" It's 2 parts, and it's still on biblicalhorizons.com. Was Job an Edomite king? So he goes through the mentions in Genesis 36 and some other things. And it's I did a little bit more reading yesterday on this, and apparently looking at that, because Elihu is a bit of a mysterious character. I think it says he's a Buzzite, and this one article I read said that that means he was descended from Nahor, who was Abraham's Abraham's brother's son.
His brother, yeah.
Was Buzz or someone. So there's, and the mention of T-Man, I think that's how you pronounce it, but there's a lot of evidence that it's within the Edomite culture, and but it's post Abraham, because they're descendants of these people. Yeah. So, but the connection, I think, is the fact that Job is the successor of Balaam, and that in my theory is that because Job is selected, people say that that's where we get onto the sons of God here, that the Satan is one angel amongst all the other angels, and they're the sons of God assembled. And that's when God points out, as if they're in heaven, and then God points out on the earth Job. But the sons of God are the other priest kings, and they're assembled together. And God chooses Job from the flock for sacrifice, and that pattern follows the structure of choosing the offering to the burnt offering or the ascension offering in Leviticus 1. It's the same as Jesus' baptism, where there's all these Jewish men and women, but coming to be baptized, and God chooses the one who is actually blameless, his son, and then he's sent into the wilderness to be tested. So the idea here is that Job is all these other guys who are the ones who question him later are actually priest kings as well from other nearby nations, and they meet together, and they're like Noah, they're like Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, they're like Melchizedek. These guys were all priest kings. Each one had their city, but they were also like the high priest. So they would use one knife to offer sacrifices to heaven, and then they would use the sword to judge murderers on the earth, which Noah was the first person to do that, to have that authority as God's right hand. Adam failed. So, Adam was cut, and then he was supposed to be the bearer of the sword, but instead he got chased out by the sword. The angels kept it. That sword should have been given to him. So Noah is told, well, to restrain the violence that corrupted the world before the flood, I now give you the authority to execute murderers. And it's like communion. A taste of death holds back death. Just a little, like an inoculation, like I don't want to say vaccine, but, it's something where you give someone a little dose of something and that makes them immune. And the idea that to restrain evil, the people say, well, if you're pro-life, why do you believe in the death penalty? God allows examples like the death of Ananias and Sapphira to warn people. In Job, Elihu says God will allow men to suffer. He'll even send them kind of scary dreams to warn them of, and so that they'll restrain themselves from evil. So the idea that there's this taste of death to withhold death. Now I've forgotten where I was going with that, but anyway, I think the idea was that Job was bearing the sins of Balaam so that God wouldn't destroy Edom. So even though he was unaware of what was happening, and I know it sounds weird, but the idea that he was being selected as a sacrifice to suffer, there is the idea of the theodicy, which I should really look up. I think that's the word. Why is there suffering death? But if you look at Job was a priest king because first he loses his offspring and his possessions. And, that's the fruit of the land and the womb, which is what makes you a king. Those are the things that promised to Adam and promised to Abraham. If you don't have food, you don't have a personal future. If you don't have offspring, you don't have a cultural future. So those things were taken from him. So he's just left with his wife, and it's a bit like Adam and Eve in that sense. So that's the kingdom aspect. So that is stripped away from him. That's the land aspect. And then the garden aspect is his priesthood. And that's where Satan is then allowed to corrupt his flesh, and he's covered in boils. And that makes him under the law of Moses, which is another indication that this was, that they were familiar with the Levitical law. They were still operating as priest kings, but Israel was mediating for them. Okay, so in a sense they were now, but they were still operating. So his kingdom was removed, and that was stripped from him, and then his flesh was corrupted, and that made him unacceptable as a sacrifice to God. Levite priests had to be perfect physically.
Yeah.
because they were supposed to be blameless, perfect sacrifices without blemish. And and that's why Satan says skin for skin. It's all about, because the priests, and under the law, the skin of the sacrifice was given to the priests. Adam and Eve were clothed in skin. So they were not only one flesh, they were then united under one skin, in a sense, on the day of coverings, which is what atonement means. So Job could not now offer atoning sacrifices because his own skin was corrupt.
Yeah. Wow.
We see the same thing in Revelation. Moses received tablets of stone because human hearts are stony. We've got hard hearts, like Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord needs to be cut into us. But when Jesus opens the scroll, which is the new covenant, similar new covenant event, Jesus ascends to heaven. We see that in Revelation. That's when he opens the seven-sealed scroll. The scroll's written on skin. It's written on vellum. And vellum had to be spotless. Vellum had to be pure, because if it had spots on it, you could misread it. If you're writing and there's extra punctuation that's actually just because it was a spotty animal,
Wow.
then you can't. That's why vellum was expensive, because they had to reject so many skins because they weren't without spot. So the idea of Job being spotty means, well, God's obviously rejected you. You are no longer you're no longer blameless in a ceremonial sense. God has rejected you as a priest. You have been cursed. What is happening? Either God is unrighteous or you're unrighteous. You're one of us. They were all sons of God. So the irony is, they were trying to make out that Job was cursed because he was unrighteous. In other words, he was the worst of the bunch. He was the worst of the sons of God. And yet he was chosen because he was the best. That's what is revealed at the end. God is vindicated, and Job is vindicated as well. God never reveals to him why he was chosen in the sense of the purpose of it. The clue, I think, is, as I'm working through Isaiah, is King Hezekiah, right at the center of the book. Even though Israel couldn't have priest kings, they had priestly kings. They had priestly kings like David, who ate the bread, and Hezekiah, who trusted God and took the scroll. He opens the scroll like Jesus opens the scroll in Revelation. There's this threat. The end of the world's about to come. John's weeping because the entire Old Covenant era is coming to an end. There'll be no more animal sacrifices. God will have to destroy the world. But he pulls something out of his sleeve again, just as he did in the Garden of Eden. There's mercy. There's a new sacrifice, and John sees the Lamb standing. And so God can let the entire world off the hook. The wrath is now paid for. And that's Jesus opening the scroll in heaven. But that also means that judgment falls upon the old order, and all the blood, the atoning blood is now, that was holding things back, is no longer serving a purpose, and it's poured back out on Israel in judgment. So, but the skin is the idea that it's a covering, and that's why the priests wore linen, because that was like a ceremonial skin. When the high priest went into the most holy place on the Day of Atonement, he didn't wear his usual robes. He just wore this ceremonial skin. When Jesus rose from the dead, he left the ceremonial skin in the tomb, the linen.
Yeah.
The tabernacle had various coverings. The innermost one was linen, and then it had ram skin and goat skin, which is Jacob and Esau, because one's smooth and one's hairy, the two brothers. Then it had a covering of, people say it's dolphin and porpoise and all sorts of stuff. It was actually beadwork. It was actually coloured beads. So from a distance, it looked like a rainbow serpent, with all the scales.
Wow.
So the idea of Job's skin being made corrupt it's a big deal, and that's why Satan says skin for skin. So, but these guys used to offer sacrifices, and so that, I think that I was talking about Hezekiah, where he goes into God and opens the scroll, but then later it talks about him being sick almost to death, And then you don't find out what's making him sick until Isaiah comes with a poultice made of figs, which is Garden of Eden stuff. And Hezekiah's boil is healed. And Job was covered in boils. So I think there's a connection, the idea that Hezekiah was picturing Christ's ministry as a priest king, where, in the New Testament, God has finally put the two roles back together. Christ is a priest king, like Noah, like Melchizedek, which is why it says after the order of Melchizedek. He's not a priest after the order of Aaron because he's fulfilled that. He's put the two halves back together, as Ephesians 2 says. God cut Adam into two halves like the Abrahamic sacrifices. And, now he's put them back together in Christ. So I think the purpose was that, even though it's not explicit, that as Balaam's successor, Job was actually bearing the sins of his people as a sacrifice so that God wouldn't have to destroy the nation, just as Hezekiah saved Judah from destruction at that point. They copped it under Babylon. But so it's the idea of a king who becomes a suffering servant. So that's Job, who is a king who then humbles himself and becomes the suffering servant here. And so obviously the other purposes of concerning suffering, etc., are still there. But what we miss is the liturgical aspect of Leviticus being fulfilled in the order of events. And it's the same thing with Revelation and other the things in the ministry of Jesus, where, for instance, the Day of Atonement, where he takes off his robe and washes their feet and then puts it back on, same as the high priest would take off his robes and, cleanse Israel and then put them back on again. It's a symbolic death and resurrection where you're stripped naked, in a sense, and all you have is your ceremonial skin as a sacrifice, and then you put on your robes again as a king. So you temporarily become a servant. So I think that's the key to Job, the idea that these other guys, his accusers, and perhaps Elihu as well, were sons of God. They were mediators between heaven and earth. They were human beings, so they represented people on earth in the court of heaven, but they were also given authority by God to represent heaven to people on earth. And we see that in liturgy. I think maybe I mentioned that last time, where in liturgically, the priest, if the priest or minister would face the front of the church as a member of the congregation, as a son of man, but then he would turn and speak and preach as a son of God. And that's those two roles that Christ has, as son of man, son of Adam, and also as a son of God. And it's which direction he's facing in. He's the mediator between heaven and earth, the negotiator. He's with a ministry of reconciliation. So, and that's why Jesus says that they'll be called the sons of God, because they're peacemakers. And he's the primary, like you make peace between heaven and earth.
Wow.
And as we do that, as we come together for communion, Christ has made peace between heaven and earth. The result of that is we have peace between each other as brothers and sisters. So the ministry of reconciliation is vertical and then horizontal, that's a pretty common understanding. So that's what a son of God is. It's someone who speaks on God's behalf as God's mouthpiece. When it says, God would speak to Moses and then Moses would speak to Israel. The word always becomes flesh. God speaks through people. So, obviously he first has to speak to the prophet, but he uses mediators. He rarely speaks directly.
Yeah.
I think that's to do with the idea that the Father didn't speak from heaven until Jesus' baptism. I mean, he spoke to Mary, but it's the idea of a hierarchy, and God speaks. That the word has to become flesh. I like to say there's a difference between incantation, which is magic words, and incarnation. And the challenge for ministers or for any Christian is if you want to speak, if you want to tell people the gospel, you have to have a life that represents that. The word has to be made flesh in you. Otherwise, you have no credibility. You're a hypocrite. So God spoke through holy men, as it says in Hebrews, and now he speaks through his son. So the word Adam was supposed to be the Word made flesh in that sense. He was supposed to be light as a human being, moral light, an example. Anyway, it's all related, but it's once you get the architecture in mind and just how, the garden, land, world thing, which is kind of things, the same thing sort of multiplied through these different domains, it's very consistent. So I think Job was a priest king, and then at the end he's restored and he receives double of everything that he had before. So there again is the inheritance. It's a big deal. It's he's now a priest king again. And he's a good guy. So he's the opposite of Balaam. Balaam comes up again and again and again. He's in Revelation, he's used as a symbol to describe the Judaizers who were trying to destroy the church, because they were basically doing it for money. They were the ones who were supported by the temple sacrificial system and the Pharisees, etc. They were on the take, and they were corrupt. They were being paid to destroy the church. Well, it's cancel culture.
Wow, that's wild. Well, that's incredible, man.
I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But I think one thing, the area we fail is when we look at Job as something isolated from everything else.
Yeah,
it's like Revelation. If you look at Revelation isolated from everything else, when really everything in Revelation can be found in it's using Old Testament symbols, but it's actually simply presenting all the stuff that's in the rest of the New Testament in a symbolic way. It's all there, but we fail to see the connections. So it's the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses is required. And when you have a certain pattern that keeps recurring and a certain architecture that keeps recurring, you're not just trying to prove something from one example.
Yeah.
You can say, okay, look, it's a bit like it's a probably bad example, but if you have someone in a workplace who's making, this came up the other day, it was interesting. Someone was telling me how they work out. Someone in a workplace who's, say, a woman who's making accusations of sexual harassment, and she's made accusations against 20 different men, this one woman. But then if you have 20 women who are making accusations against one man.
It's one man, yeah.
Then it's more likely that they're telling the truth.
Different story, yeah.
But with the first example, it's one woman who's complained about 20 different men. Yeah, I think you might be lying. So there's the idea that how many witnesses do you have and what kind of witnesses are they? Then you can work out what the truth is. So that's the legal defense. So once again, tying Hezekiah with Job, I think the clues are there. The fact that it's a king who's suffering and sick and his people are possibly under threat. And then another irony is that later on in Isaiah, I think it's actually earlier than the story of Hezekiah. That's put in the middle for a reason. Edom, the nation Edom, is offered as a sacrifice for the other nations. It's because Edom sounds a lot like Adam, and there's this running joke about Edom, Esau, the natural brother, being like Adam. It's a bit like Saul and David. Saul was the tall, strong guy who was Adamic in that he trusted in his own strength, and he failed because he kept disobeying God. So he didn't submit to heaven. He wanted dominion on earth without submitting to heaven. He just kept getting it wrong. David did worse things than Saul, but David submitted to heaven and repented, and he did trust God. So the idea that Edom would be offered as a sacrifice for other nations at some point there, it's like Adam, the old Adam dying. And Isaiah contrasts Saul and David when it talks about Sennacherib coming, because Sennacherib actually conquers all these cities that were related to events in Saul's life, and he ends on the hill overlooking Jerusalem, which is where it's the city of Nob, which is the one where Saul killed all the priests. And Sennacherib is there, and he can't get into the city, and he's shaking his fist. God's holding him back, as he promised to Hezekiah. But then after that, you have a promise of the shoot of Jesse. So it's like, okay, Sennacherib's come in, he's wiped out all the cities of Saul, and now we have a promise of the son of Jesse who would come through, who probably is Hezekiah at that point. But then it's a Davidic promise. So once again, it's a contrast between the old Adam and the new Adam. There's always this the earthly man and the heavenly man, a son of man, but then a son of man who is also a son of God, who submits to heaven. And that's my point is that when you see that these themes just keep coming up again and again and again, described in different ways and in different parts of history, when you look at it, you say, "Oh, I see what you did there." like here's it's the same old priest king stuff, but here it is in a different guise. Here it is in a liturgical structure. Here it is in a historical story. Every mention of a city in that passage is significant. No detail is just there, just thrown in. Everything matters.
Yeah.
So I think that's why in the beginning of Job, it expects us to realize that this, in a sense, is a kind of a sequel, and that it's drawing on things in previous scripture, which, if it was the first book, it wouldn't be doing that. It assumes that you know Leviticus. It assumes that you know the genealogy in Genesis. So that all ties together as well.
Wow, I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
I also thought it makes sense just with the sheer amount that Job has, that he's not just a regular guy. Placing him as a king fits the context.
But also we need to understand. Job, sorry to interrupt again. Abraham was the same. Abraham was a rich man. The idea that he was a king and that Melchizedek met with him as an equal in a sense. So sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, that's great. So I have a couple questions. I want to address the brother theme because this is something that's very clearly shown, at least when you read Genesis. You see the contrast with Cain and Abel, then Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob, Joseph and his brothers, Tamar, she has twins in the womb that are, fighting just like Jacob and Esau. I can't remember what, Perez's brother's name was, but
Zerah.
Okay, so do you see is that, I guess, the grander idea behind that theme? Is this the Adam in the new Adam, Christ?
Yep.
Is that how you see that? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm making that connection correctly.
I was just thinking this morning. I thought when Jacob blessed Joseph's sons and he crossed his arms, which is a chiasm.
Same thing,
but wow. It's the basic chiasm. The basic chiasm is if you I can't remember which way around Jesus said it, but if you humble yourself, you'll be exalted, and if you exalt yourself, you'll be humbled. So it's left, right, and then right, left. And you see that in Matthew 25, where the sheep and the goats, left hand, right hand, the priestly sheep end up on the kingly side, and the kingly goats end up on the priestly side because they're being humbled. So it's the idea that the one who humbles himself before God will be exalted, and that's usually the younger brother, and then he gets the inheritance. So it's the same when we talk about Cain and Abel. It was the same kind of crisscross because Cain was the firstborn, and I think it was when it says God didn't regard Cain's offering. I think it's the idea that Cain brought his first, which because he was the firstborn, but he wasn't supposed to, because priesthood, submission to heaven, must precede dominion on earth. So Cain's like, well, I'm the king, I'm the firstborn. I'm going to push in first and make my offering. But in a sense, you've got to, and there was I don't think these offerings were made by fire. I don't think Noah was the first to do that. But up until then, it was the flaming sword that devoured them, because that was the sword. In a sense, the offering was killed instead of you. If you tried to get into the garden, the sword would devour you. And so you made these offerings. But in a sense, I can imagine there's the two cherubim there guarding the gate, like the pillars in the temple, and the various, Jesus standing between Moses and Elijah. It's the same kind of thing with the two. They're the bouncers at the door.
Mm.
You know, it's like it's not a nightclub, but there's bouncers.
Yeah.
You can only get in under certain conditions. And of course, you have the sons of Aaron, who were supposed to be the two cherubim, and the flaming sword came out and devoured them.
Wow.
Because they disobeyed God.
Yeah.
And then you have the sons of Eli, who were committing different sins and were killed in a different way. But once again, they're supposed to be the two cherubim at the door. And then in the New Testament, I'll just throw this in. The New Testament begins with a Levite called John, who dies. He gets his head cut off, and most likely another Levite called John, who would live until Jesus returned to destroy Jerusalem. And that second John was the one who Jesus trusted his mother into John's care as his successor. So once again, you've got the New Testament with John, two Levites standing either side of it, John the Baptist and John the Apostle. And what's in the middle? Pentecost, flaming sword, this fire flashing to and fro in between them.
Goodness. Wow.
And and it's the gate, it's the gateway back to, like Jesus says, I'm the door. This is the door. So these two guys are the bouncers. So you have the witness at the end of the Old Testament was John the Baptist, the final Old Testament prophet, and then John the Apostle was the longest living apostle as the end of the testimony of Jesus. So, which is a legal testimony, and they were two witnesses, like Moses and Elijah. You had to have two legal witnesses to condemn someone, and it was their testimony that condemned Jerusalem. John actually, condemned the Herods, and then Revelation wiped the Herods out of history. That was the judgment that came. So, but what I was going to say was, I think the flaming sword, if you can imagine it kind of flashing backwards and forwards, it's like a flaming tongue. This is the fire-breathing God whose nostrils are kindled, as the Hebrew says elsewhere. But the two witnesses are like your two eyes, the two cherubim, and then you have this flaming tongue. It's like this: the face of God is the garden gate. And when it says God didn't regard Cain's offering, it seems to me that it was actually the flaming sword that turned to Abel, which is a bit like Jacob crossing his arms and choosing the younger son.
Wow.
In a sense, it's like God choosing Abel's offering over Cain's.
Yeah.
And so that's when Cain's face, like there's the face of God, they're face to face. Cain's face falls, and God says, "Why is your face fallen?" So, what's it? The bread was called the face bread. It's when it's the person who is face to face with God and His throne. So yes, you're right. It's the choice, choosing the faithful brother. It's the same with what was it? It says Amalek was the first among the nations, and I think that because Amalek was descended from Esau, so it wasn't that Amalek's not listed in Genesis 10, so it's not referring to him as being one of the first nations in the world. I think it's saying that Amalek was like the firstborn, because he was descended from Esau.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole point there was that Israel as a nation didn't exist; it was created by God.
Wow. And
God said to Pharaoh, "Israel is my firstborn son." So God had chosen a younger son. The nation was a younger son.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
And he was going to inherit. Of course, when Israel comes out of Egypt, and then who are they attacked by? Amalek.
Yeah.
I'm going to cut you out of history. I'm going to inherit.
That's nuts. Wow.
And of course, you trace that all the way through. Edom's a problem. Not just, but there's Edom in various guises. You have Haman versus Mordecai in the book of Esther. Mordecai is descended from the same man as Saul, Kish, and Haman is an Agagite, and Agag was the Amalekite king that Saul failed to kill, that Samuel cut into pieces.
Oh, wow.
So the book of Esther starts with a rematch between Saul and Agag. Agag is descended from Esau. Okay? So they're at it again. It's back again. Who's going to be the firstborn? Who's a bit like Perez and Zerah or Jacob and Esau? Who's going to be the first one out of the womb? Who's the one who's going to win the inheritance as the firstborn? But God keeps swapping, like Perez and Zerah. Achan gets cut off, and the line goes through Perez. and Rahab, who gets a mention in Matthew 1. So, but then in the New Testament, the background of Matthew, where the Herods are trying to wipe out Jesus, the Herods were Idumeans. They were Edomites.
Yeah.
So Esau was on the throne.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus talks about the beginning of sorrows, the beginning of birth pangs, I think maybe I mentioned this last time too. Once again, it's about, okay, we've got Jesus versus Herod, Jacob versus Esau, the heavenly son versus the natural son, the spiritual son versus the natural son. Who's going to be the first one out of the womb? And the contractions are the events leading up to the Jewish war. All of the earthquakes and the nation rising against nation and the upheavals and the zealots and all of this stuff was the land outcome of what was happening spiritually. And so when Jesus talks about birth pangs, it was the birth pangs of the new covenant order. And which king is going to inherit? And what's really interesting is the 7 years of Daniel's final week was AD 64 to AD 70. Okay, that's the 70th week.
Mm-hmm.
And you had 3.5 years of persecution of the saints, the tribulation. And then you had 3.5 years of vengeance upon Jerusalem. And so that's all of this stuff was happening. But the Herods actually left the city before the vengeance fell. And they left the priests behind. So as in Job, where Job lost all of his kingly attributes, he lost his offspring and he lost his cattle and everything, all of his wealth. But the priesthood was left behind, and they stayed until there were not enough priests left to offer sacrifice because the Romans were killing them all. The priests were actually being slain as animals. And so it's the same pattern. God stripped Old Covenant Israel of all its kingly wealth, and the Herods departed. Everything was taken by the Romans. But then he got down to the priesthood, which was rendered unclean because Christ had already fulfilled the law. And I think it's one of the Talmuds that records that on the Day of Atonement, from the time of the death of Christ to the end of the temple, when they took out the black and white stones, God had rejected the atonement every year.
Yeah.
Every year came up, no. And they, as Jews do, even when it's against them, they write it down.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say something Talmud of all places. Yeah.
Yeah. So the point is that, that's the background. It's always the true son, the natural son versus the faithful son. And God says, the faithful son is my firstborn. So when we see Christians around the world today who, it's always about the inheritance. There's like at the moment we have the secular world trying to steal the inheritance of Christendom. The Christian civilization and everything that it built has been stolen by these people who want to control the world. What do we think is going to happen? We know what's going to happen. As Christians, we can watch these people try and steal it. It's just Satan trying to steal the world again, trying to unite the globalists as in a new kind of a digital Babel and all this on a, it's the same old plan. It's a pity they don't believe the Bible because it might give them a few tips. Yeah. So,
no, that's great.
So you're right. So it's and the contrast between Balaam and Job. Balaam was the one who wanted to wipe Israel out, and once again, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but Balaam wanted to go up. He wanted to ascend 4 mountains to curse Israel. They were the 4 horns of a giant altar, and Israel would have been the sacrifice on the altar.
Wow.
God would have sent fire from heaven to destroy Israel.
Wow.
But anyway, Balaam ends up being killed, and Job succeeds him. I think it seems that from where Balaam came, he was obviously traveling around a fair bit, prophesying for money. I think that's the deal.
Yeah.
Because he didn't come from Edom then, but it looks like he was an Edomite. So, yeah. But once again, Balaam was royal. He was a priest king and a prophet. So he's obviously talented. Yeah.
That's wild. So I have a couple other questions. I just want to, comment that, we see Paul speak of Christ as firstborn and as co-heirs, which is so cool hearing you explain that, talking about birth pains. But man, you mentioned the Apostle John and how he ended up living longer than the other apostles, and we see Peter at the end of I guess it's John's gospel ask Jesus specifically, when Jesus tells him about his fate, he kind of says, well, what about John, right? This is conjecture. I mean, I don't know, but it does seem like that's kind of a loaded question. Like, why is he is it that he's jealous of John? Did they perhaps know about John? And then there's that comment that that John would never die or something, but and of course John corrects it and say that it's not the case or whatever. So I'm just curious if there was some sort of, do you think that there was some sort of idea on the apostles' part that John was going to outlive them or not even see death?
I think the way John refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that's the same idiom used when it says that God loved Jacob and hated Esau. And it's not talking about emotional love or hatred. It's talking about choosing an heir. So Isaac loved Esau. He was choosing him as the heir because he was the one with all of the earthly attributes of strength. He was a hunter. He was out and about. He was the manly one in a sense. And the picture there is it's a picture of the tabernacle, the tent with Isaac, and you've got, on the Day of Atonement you'd have two goats, where you have Jacob with goat skin on two arms, and you have Esau as the bronze altar outside the tent where they offer the sacrifice and the blood was splashed, and he's red. And he offers red, Jacob makes him some red soup. So he's a beast in a sense. The natural man is a beast. Like the violent men, the mighty men before the flood, they were like beasts. The world was filled with violence. And so Jacob, by contrast, lived among the tents in a sense. He's the priestly one because he served God in the tabernacle. And so when he comes into Isaac, who's like sitting on the Ark of the Covenant as the ruler, symbolically, same arrangement, but it's an earthly court. The trick is that he's pretending to be the natural son, but he's actually the spiritual son. And so this is, in a sense, it's swapping the two again, obviously, switching the brothers to get the blessing. So, but it's liturgical in that sense, as that there's a deception. And now I can't remember where I was going with this. Where were we again? We got into Jacob and Esau.
Apostle John.
Oh yeah, that's right. So that's right. Love and hate. Sorry, love and hate. So when Jesus says hate your father and mother, he means choose a better inheritance. Don't hang around. Don't reject Christ to serve your father and mother, to be more faithful to them for your earthly inheritance. It's not saying you actually should hate them, because he condemned others who were ripping off their parents by not looking after them in their old age. So the idiom is a choice of an inheritance. So when it says John was the disciple whom Jesus loved, he was the one whom Jesus chose to be his earthly heir. And that's why Jesus put his mother into the care of John. But it reminds me of an article written by, Jim Elliot, the martyr, the missionary, who he with his friends were speared by the tribesmen. They flew in. What's it called? The Gates of. Hang on. Anyway, yeah, it's a famous book. And his wife Elizabeth has written a lot of really good books as well. Anyway, Jim Elliot was a missionary. And he and his young friends were approaching this tribe, and they all got speared to death by the tribe. And then his wife went back and, as a missionary, and converted the whole tribe. Yeah. Like they killed her husband. So, but his brother, whose name I can't remember, Jim Elliot's brother, we never hear about him. He also was a missionary, and he served for decades. And so the contrast was between the famous brother who was killed, and the result of his death led to many people becoming missionaries, because it just highlighted the fact that, well, it's more spectacular, I guess, dying as a martyr. And yet his brother was just as faithful in many decades of service. And so I think we have the same contrast between Peter, who found out that he was going to die, and John, and Jesus said, "Well, look, this is up to me." So you're both serving. You're both serving me. I think I think it's in the Narnia series where C.S. Lewis, someone asks about somebody else, and one of the characters says, or maybe it's Aslan. Aslan says, "That's her story. It's not your story. Like mind your own business."
Right. Yeah.
So, and once again, I guess that comes back to trusting God, not comparing ourselves with one another, not looking at someone else's, ministry where they've got a huge church or a big following, and you're looking at your little faithful church where you don't see much growth, but you're teaching the word faithfully, and God is honored in both. Yeah. I think that's the key to he's got a different job for each of us.
Mm-hmm.
There's things that I would like to do in over the years that I'd like to do that, or then I realized, God hasn't given me the gifts or the opportunity for that. I'd make a big mess of it. So I'll stick with what seems to work.
Yeah.
So I think the devil can use it too. He says, "Look at that guy. Look what he's doing, or look what she's done." Or you read the biographies of saints, which are always biographical testimonies, always good, because you always learn from it. But at the same time, we need to realize that God's got different plans for everybody, and different gifts. Yeah. He loves variety. Yeah. So, But so the love and hate thing, I think, is a big deal, and once again, it comes down to the inheritance, which is the future. Jesus offers a better inheritance than the fruit of the land and the fruit of the womb, even though those things are important. They are pictures of something even better. Abraham perceived that the saints perceived there was a heavenly country beyond Canaan that was pictured in what they had received. So Jesus moved the goalposts. Yeah,
that's awesome. Cool. So I want to get back to Job and the kind of like his three friends. Are you saying that they're part of this divine council seen in chapter 1, and are they themselves kings, or do they have a role under Job's rule?
I think they were equals. Based on this, when it says the sons, it says the sons of God. Yeah. It includes Job. So it would have been. It was like a military inspection. We see the same thing in Revelation when Jesus talks to the angels or the messengers or the pastors of the 7 churches in Asia, and he deals with them. And it is a bit like a military inspection where he says, "Oh, well, your shoes need polishing. You need to stand upright. You're doing well. You need to deal with Jezebel, or I'll deal with you. You've got a Balaam in your church."
Mm-hmm.
And of course, these are sins that are in the bud. They're just starting in the New Testament churches. And then Jesus shows them the 8th church where all these sins are full grown. They have a full-grown Jezebel, the harlot, which is Jerusalem. They have a full-grown Balaam, which is the false prophet that's speaking false doctrine into the churches, like a serpent, a river from the mouth of the serpent. So he deals with it. In Job, it's the same thing, where the Lord appears, and these guys have gathered for like a ministers fraternal. They're coming together to worship, and this is when God chooses from, in Leviticus 1, it says, choose a son of the herd. That's what the Hebrew says. And so that's what God does. He chooses a son from the herd.
Mm-hmm.
So they're all sons.
Wow.
They're all sons of God. And he picks the one that's without blemish. That's why I think it's 2 or 3 times at the beginning of the book. It just keeps highlighting how blameless Job is.
Yeah.
He's without blemish.
Yeah.
So
that's great.
and God and then God points him out to Satan and says, "Have you considered my servant Job?"
Yeah.
And that's when and then Job, Satan impugns Job's motives, which is always the way. Oh, he's just doing it because you look after him so well, etc.
Yeah.
So he's chosen. So this whole idea of a divine council is God. Angels, I think I mentioned that last time. Angels are servants. Angels are not kings. Angels are not rulers in the sense that we think of as rulers. They are just yes men, and they don't wear crowns. When we talked about the elders in Revelation, I don't think they're angels because angels don't wear crowns. Sons wear crowns. Angels, like God's sons, humble themselves as servants, but then they're exalted to sit in his throne with him as sons. Jesus says, "Here am I." Well, it's Hebrews quoting Isaiah. Here am I, and the children are the sons that God has given me. And yet Jesus was cut off without having any offspring. And that's why Philip explained to the Ethiopian eunuch, well, the Savior, it was like you, was cut off without any offspring. But because he died as a blameless lamb, you, even though you're not physically perfect, like the Levite priests had to be, you are now an acceptable offering, and you can be washed as a sacrifice. That's once it's there. It is again. It's you can be baptized, even though you're not a perfect sacrifice. So, and that ties into my view on baptism once again, which is that the priests and the sacrifices were washed for ministry. And so baptism begins your ministry as an accountable worshiper. So it's not for kids. God doesn't hold kids accountable directly. Kids are accountable to their parents. God takes hierarchy seriously. So baptism is not the boundary of the church. It's or the boundary of the covenant. It's the staff uniform. So it's, or I guess I don't want to use Disneyland as an example, but it's people have this idea that the covenant has a boundary like Israel had a boundary, but that boundary's gone. Jesus removed that. Everybody's already in the covenant. As someone said the other day, how do you explain the difference between being in the covenant and being in Christ? And I say, well, everyone was in the flood. The whole world was under a global covenant that Adam messed up, and now it was coming to an end. But not everyone was in the ark. So every covenant has blessings and curses. So those who refused to get into the ark were under the covenant curses, and those who got into the ark were under the covenant blessings, but they were all in the same covenant. A covenant is obligation. So I think that's where I don't want to say, hey, everyone's wrong, but just based on the way God works through the Old Testament, the split between Jew and Gentile, which was a split between priests and kings again, and you had the same split within Israel between priests and kings. That's finished. We are now a royal priesthood, like Melchizedek, who was a priest king. And so baptism is not to do with physical offspring, because there's now no difference between Jew and Gentile. That's gone. There are still ethnic Jews. God doesn't recognize the difference. It's obsolete. So any pedo baptism is obsolete. Any credo baptism that does not make a child directly accountable to church discipline doesn't really do anything. It's the idea is that it's like a spiritual knighthood where you're submitting to death, and then you are given, like Adam, he was supposed to submit to God to die in a sense. I mean, he did go into a deep sleep, but then he was supposed to voluntarily submit, and then God would have handed him the flaming sword. So when you get baptized, it's like a knighthood. You're being a knighthood, but for a priest kingdom. You're being decapitated in a sense, like John the Baptist. You're losing the old covenant head. You're now given a new head, who is Christ, who you've submitted to, and Christ gives you his sword as his right hand. As he says in Revelation, where it talks about him ruling the nations with a rod of iron, and to one of the pastors he says, you will rule the nations with a rod of iron, like I do. We become his right hand. So baptism actually makes you it's like King Arthur's round table. Once you're baptized, you're washed, then you can come to the table. So it's the table is the food in the Garden of Eden. And if you eat it unworthily, you'll die, as Paul says. It's not for children. This is you drink the cup of judgment. You are like Peter, you're willing to be a living sacrifice. Jesus said, feed my lambs, you're going to die with them as the lamb as well. You're sacrificial lambs. So it's the difference between Passover and communion is Passover provided a covering for the houses of men, but communion, we voluntarily become human lambs in the garden. So Passover was fulfilled and completed and abolished in the cross, and finished the divide between the houses of Israel and the houses of the Gentiles. If you remember that Jesus sent the disciples to the houses of Israel, he said, don't go to the houses of the Gentiles, go to the houses of Israel in Matthew 10. But then in Matthew 25, the Passover between the sheep and the goats, the sheep, that comes from Exodus 12. That's the Passover chapter, isn't it? Choose between, you can take an animal from the sheep or the goats. So this Matthew 24 is a Passover of the entire kingdom, Jews and Gentiles together. And those who followed Herod as the hairy goat they're going to lose their kingdoms. And those who followed Jesus as the smooth Jacob were the ones who inherited the new order, the kingdom. So once again, it's the chiasm.
Interesting, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, that's my take on baptism. It answers the questions from the pedobaptists who say, why don't you include your kids? Because that is a good question. If baptism is a covenant sign, why don't you include your kids? My answer is everyone's already in the new covenant. Everyone on the planet, by default, by the cross. Everyone is now obligated to repent and believe you're in it, whether you like it or not. And that means that the gospel, if you remember in Deuteronomy where it says the Shema is hear, O Israel. Shema means hear, and hear carries the connotation of obey. So the gospel goes to all nations because they're already in the covenant. Hear, O nations. Yeah. Christ has died for you. Israel's mediation is gone. You are now directly accountable to Christ. God is no longer overlooking your sins in Acts 17:30. He doesn't, as in the King James where it says, God winked at the sins of the nations, or he overlooked them, closed his eyes. His eyes are now open, and he sees, and they are accountable. So I think that would also have a lot to do with, we're talking about feminization of the modern church. If you see baptism as, and who was it? Andrew Tate, this guy, he's become a Muslim, and there's Greek Orthodox Christians, Islam, they offer a very sort of a masculine religion. Islam obviously goes way too far with that. There's a lot wrong there, but the idea that men are to be the protectors and providers, I think if we have baptism as a rite of passage where, I hate to mention it, but like the Jedi, you take a vow, you have to live by it. Jesus gives us a flaming sword, which is kind of like a lightsaber, but the thing is then, because you've made a personal vow, you're accountable to church discipline directly. If you're in sin and you're put under church discipline, the sword is taken from you, Jesus' gospel sword, and you are put back under the sword and called to repent. So everyone on the planet is either under the sword, called to repent and believe, or bearing the sword as a gospel witness. And so that means that the new covenant sacraments are actually a lot like the events in Exodus 24, where the entire nation was present in worship, but only Moses and the elders, the 70 elders who represented the 70 nations, went up the mountain and ate and drank with God, and he did not lay his hand on them. So they were they became the mediators. They represented the sons of God that ruled the 70 nations before. That worship, that mediation was now being concentrated in Israel, and those 70 elders represented the 70 nations. And then they would sacrifice 70 bulls in the Feast of Booths, which is, the ones that Gentiles could come to. So I think it's been the idea of the sons of God in Job and new covenant sacraments if you're a son of God, you partake in the sacraments as someone who offers who represents earth before heaven, and it represents heaven before earth as a peacemaker. So I think people say, well, that's not something anyone's really said that like that before. But I'd say, well, the Christians who don't bother with covenant theology at all get it right by default. In the sense, they're the ones who say, well, when you become a Christian, you personally choose, you get baptized, then you can come to the table. They don't bother with the covenant stuff, because the reason they get it right is because the new covenant is universal anyway, as it was before Abraham. So that ties into the idea of a son of God. And John says, beloved, now are we the sons of God. He's not saying, oh, now we're Christians. He's like, no, now are we, not the Jews, not the priesthood of Aaron, not those who offer animal sacrifices anymore, in the same way that Israel succeeded the priest kings of Noah because they'd become corrupt. Now are we the sons of God. We are the ones who offer sacrifices, but they're sacrifices of praise, and we live as living sacrifices. We offer ourselves now because Christ has offered the blood once and for all. Our testimony, we fill up the sufferings of Christ in our sufferings as a testimony. So I think the idea of the sacraments then is we are a royal priesthood. It was pictured in Israel when, after they failed to go into the land, God gave men and women the robes with the 4 blue tassels, and they were to look at the tassels and remember the law. So in a sense, baptism and Acts repeatedly says both men and women, both men and women. Paul says it a few times, both men and women. It's Adam's and Eve's. This is Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden getting a robe of righteousness instead of animal skins, back to the skins. Baptism is a skin, in a sense. It's a robe of authority and accountability. And if we realize that, baptism becomes a much bigger deal. It's not something to be entered into lightly. However, the apostles baptized anyone who wanted to be baptized. They didn't wait. Like, they made sure, I'm sure, that you understood what you were getting into. However, they didn't say, well, we'll just wait and see.
Yeah. Because
if you got baptized, you made a personal vow, and then you were accountable to that vow, and then you could be put under church discipline if you blew it. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
so that's.
I can't. I mean, as a way of supporting your take there, I'll note that Jesus got baptized at the age 30 when he was beginning his ministry, which I never really thought much of. But if you kind of put that in context, and he also,
to play the devil's advocate, to play the pedo-Baptist advocate, Abraham was circumcised as an adult, but then everyone in his house, all the males were circumcised. But and Jesus was baptized at 30 apparently because that was the age, that was the minimum age for the high priest.
For the priest, yeah.
So there's that. But my argument there is because they say, well, all of Israel was baptized. My argument is yes, but Israel was already circumcised. Israel as a nation was baptized for ministry. Israel was a child in Abraham, and then Israel grew up in Egypt and became a nation physically as a nation, as one flesh in a sense. And then Israel was born again in Moses. And under Moses in the wilderness, no children were circumcised. It was all about circumcision of heart. So even though it was, and Paul uses that as an explanation in 1 Corinthians where he says they all passed through the water. Jesus says to Nicodemus, born again by water and the Spirit. Water and the Spirit is the Red Sea and the pillar of fire. And so he says, Nicodemus says, can a man enter into his mother's womb? He's talking about circumcision. Jesus says, no, not the first birth, the second birth. Israel's second birth as a nation was passing through the Red Sea. It's not about physical offspring. It's about sons of God. They were to become, as a nation, Israel's my firstborn. As a nation, they are going to offer sacrifices as a mediator between heaven and earth. But even Israel as a nation required a priesthood of actual individual sons of God who were the sons of Aaron. So the idea is of a son of God is someone who serves God as a mediator, and that's the deal. So Jesus was baptized at age 30. I mean, people say, well, maybe people brought their babies out to John to be baptized, but it was a baptism of repentance. And then they say, well, maybe Jesus' baptism, like the baptism of the apostles later, included households. And I say, well, was everyone in Abraham's household circumcised? Every individual? No, not the women, not the females, because it was a sign concerning physical offspring. Circumcision was about physical offspring. Yeah. And that's childhood in a sense. You're under the sword. Mm-hmm. Baptism is when you get the sword. And so my argument is, and we have credo baptism and pedo baptism. Mm-hmm. Credo baptism is when you're for believers. Pedo baptism is for children, includes children. I call it Jedi baptism as a joke because it's more like being a Jedi. It's you're under a vow, even though Jedis couldn't marry. Apparently, I'm not hugely into Star Wars, but I think the idea of Obi-Wan having a sword of God in a sense and putting it down and then being slain as a martyr. When people talk about Jesus being a pacifist, and the Old Testament isn't relevant now because Jesus was a pacifist. But what's interesting is Star Wars: A New Hope follows the covenant pattern in the Bible exactly to a T. I think it's why it's so familiar to us, the basic story. So Obi-Wan, like Jesus, knew when to put down his lightsaber and be slain, but then he became more powerful than they could possibly imagine. And Revelation shows him coming with a flaming sword against Jerusalem to blow up the Death Star. Like that's the deal, like,
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So when they say Jesus was a pacifist, I'm like, well, Jesus submitted to God on earth that he might then and ascended to heaven representing mankind before heaven's court. And then he comes representing heaven's court against those on earth who are killing the saints. And so he comes against Jerusalem to slay with the covenant oath. That's why he's instead of having the name in his mouth and the sword on his thigh, he has the name on his thigh and the sword on his mouth. There is another chiasm. The priesthood and kingdom have been swapped over. So he's finished, he's completed the priesthood, and now he's coming as the reigning king to destroy the nation, just as Solomon wiped out all of David's enemies when he took the throne. It was a new broom, right? I'm going to kill or send into exile everyone who opposed my father. David ruled over Jerusalem for 40 years. Jesus ascended to heaven and ruled over Jerusalem for 40 years and then wiped it out. So, that's there as well. That's awesome. I think if we realize that getting baptized is a submission to authority, humble yourself. Because baptism's humbling. If you're being immersed, it's humiliating. You're being weak. You're being, you're not being, as I like to say, rain is a sprinkling that extends the old life. Immersion is a flood that kills the old life and brings a new creation. It's the land coming up out of the sea after the flood. So immersion, like it's a death. It's a sign of Jonah. Jonah talks about being dead in Jonah 2, where he descends down into the bars of Hades, etc. And then he symbolically rises from the dead. Jesus said it's a sign of Jonah. I don't see how we can get away from baptism being some kind of delegation of authority as well as all the other things. And the key is how worshippers were given the authority of the tabernacle in those robes as men and women. And I think that's the point that Acts is making, that both men and women now have this extension of of Jesus' priesthood, not just the clergy. We still need clergy. We still have male clergy as representatives of Christ, but then the next level is, Adam and the Adams and the Eves who represent Christ as the ones who bring others to him. So that ties into the idea of the sons of God in Job. Obviously, the new covenant extends that to women, but it was predicted in the old covenant as well. What's interesting is that the Jews started to withhold the tasseled robe from women because, they just thought, well, no, it's very male-centric. But God is always, no. Yes, the males first as the ones who are first accountable, but then it extends to those who are under their wings. And the word wings is the corners of the robe. It's the Hebrew word. It's the same wing, a corner. Ruth under the wings of Boaz, but the women get to wear a robe as well. So the priests had a sash. Maybe I mentioned this last time as well. The priests have a red sash that flowed like blood onto the ground, and they wore white linen as a sacrifice back to the skin. But that was death. But then the men and women had blue tassels like 4 rivers from the Garden of Eden, and that's resurrection. They're a new creation. So,
Wow.
and it's the same in Revelation where you see the lamb at the center of the city, who's the slain lamb, which is the white linen and the red sash. And then you have the bridal city, which has a river of life.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to get to sons of God because you're already touching on it, but I want to get into the Nephilim, giant whole discussion.
The fun stuff.
The fun stuff. We're going to get a little weird here. So I've covered the angelic view extensively on this podcast, and I want to hear a defense of like the sethite view, which I believe is the view that you hold. So the connection here with Job is that you've already given your take as far as chapter 1 and who the sons of God there are humans. They're also mentioned, I think it's in 38, but this isn't when God is speaking to Job, and he's talking about the sons of God that were marveling at creation. Now, what's your take on that? Are those angels, the sons of God, ever referring to angels? Is there legitimacy to that view?
Yeah, well, the symbolism is that the stars of heaven picture kings, they picture rulers. Sun, moon, and stars were given to govern night and day and the seasons, and their counterparts on earth are human kings. So when it talks about, I think it's in Daniel where it talks about Nebuchadnezzar wanting to change. Oh no, it's later Daniel where it's actually talking about I think it's maybe about the Herods changing the times and the seasons. And the idea is that these are human stars. And so when it talks about in Isaiah 13, when it talks about stars falling from heaven, it's talking about the Babylonian kings losing their dynasty. As James Jordan says, when God says your stars are going to fall, he's saying your clock is going to stop. Your time is up. So your days are numbered. They're finished. Excuse me, I'm just going to turn it's getting a bit, it's actually summer here. I'm just going to turn the ceiling fan on.
Okay.
Here we go. Yeah.
So I guess
the stars, I was just going to say the stars it says the stars rejoice. Hang on, was it anyway, I haven't got it in front of me, but Job 38 talks about the stars in heaven and then the sons of God on earth. And the idea is that the point is there's a new heavens and a new earth. There are new rulers in heaven and there are new rulers on earth. It's not talking about rejoicing in the creation. It's talking about the waters receding after the flood, because he says God closed up the waters. Wow. And that didn't happen in the creation. So when he says sons of God there, he's talking about Noah and Noah's priesthood. Initially Noah's sons. So that's the context. And Job, as a son of God, would have identified with that. God's taking him right back to the beginning of these sons of God as ministers and saying, I'm the one who basically started this off. I'm the one who set up this order that was supposed to restrain the violence that would destroy the world before the flood. As I said, as an inoculation in the same way that God killed Ananias and Sapphira so that anyone else would be afraid to do what they did, set them up in his example. We could do with a few public executions today just to remind people that there is a death penalty on certain things. And even God is not for carrying it out all the time. You make someone an example, and you remind people that Adam and Eve, there was a death penalty on what they did. There was a death penalty on what Cain did. In Leviticus, there's a death penalty on murder, adultery, blasphemy, homosexual acts, bestiality, etc. But David committed murder and adultery, and yet he repented. So just as in Eden, even if you committed an offense that had a death penalty, but you repented, there was mercy available always. God said to Adam, "You'll surely die," but he didn't. And that was in a sense, it's to attract Satan to come in and try and get God to kill them. And God says, "Oh, actually, I've got an animal sacrifice up my sleeve here to let them off." And the nation of Israel became an animal sacrifice and as a substitute set up as a world model. And that's why the focus is then on Israel as an example for the rest of the world, and still an example. The Old Testament Israel is still an example for us today. As we read it, we see that, okay, this is how God dealt with that nation. And at the time, he was overlooking all nations. But now any nation can be God's country if they obey God, and they can be blessed by him. So, so the sons of God there, that's a reference. There's another one in Deuteronomy 32, I think, or is it?
Yeah.
Anyway, where he talks about God divided the nations among the sons of God, but Israel is my inheritance.
Yeah. And
I think that the angel position is that those sons of God were the demonic angels, the false gods, but no, those sons of God there were the Noahic tribal priest kings. And God says, yep, all those nations in Genesis 10, each of them had their tribal priest king.
Yeah.
But Israel is my inheritance. And in a sense, he's saying, Israel is my successor. Israel's sacrifices are the ones like Abel, the ones that I will regard. I will no longer regard the sacrifices of these Canaanites because they've failed to become corrupt once again. There were still a few good ones like Melchizedek, who was basically handing his inheritance over to Abraham, saying, "Yep, well, this is my kingdom, but God's giving it to you, and that's okay."
Wow.
That's what he was doing. He understood. He was righteous. But then when Joshua came back, Melchizedek's successor, a few generations later, didn't want to hand it over. That was Adonizedek. Anyway, yeah, that's the one where God stopped the sun and sent. Was that the same battle? Joshua 10 sent hailstones. That's why there's hailstones in Revelation, because the Herods didn't want to hand the inheritance over. They were the kings of Jerusalem who were like Adonizedek and didn't want to hand it over to Jesus as Joshua. So the hailstones there are symbolic of that. It's meme warfare. It's like, you guys have been just like that guy, and what happened to him? So
wow.
Yeah. But anyway, so that's the sons of God in Deuteronomy and Job 38 are the priest kings.
Yeah.
Who and so the idea is that the sons of God, the meek inherit the earth or the land, same word, either way. The meek, it's as I said, if you humble yourself before heaven, priesthood, then you receive dominion on earth, kingdom. And that's the theme that runs right through the Bible. That is the two trees in Eden, the priestly tree of life, which is like bread, corresponds to bread, and the kingly tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is discernment. Adam was called to discern what the truth was behind what Satan said, and he failed. Solomon was a cunning judge because he could discern people's hearts. When he's faced with the two prostitutes, he says, "Bring me a baby and I'll cut it in half." And they go, one says, "Yeah," and the other one goes, "No." And he's like, "Right, okay, I know who's who now." That's the whole thing of deception again, where there's righteous deception that exposes people's hearts.
Yeah.
So, and Jesus did it too. It says on the Emmaus Road, he made as though he would go further. He wasn't going to go further, but he wanted to discern their hearts. They said, no, come in with us. And they passed the test. So
even he cloaked his identity. Even there's
exactly, yes.
says that that was even a deception that he was Jesus. And
and it wasn't until he broke bread that they realized that he revealed who he was. So that goes back to baptism as well, where just very quickly, in Exodus 20, where it says, "Don't make an idol of anything in heaven or on earth or on the waters under the earth," which is heaven, land, sea, above, beside, below. That's the tabernacle as well, 3 levels. That's the ark as well, 3 levels. And then so Jesus he's hidden in the waters. He's immersed. You can't see him. And then he's revealed from the waters, and that's when the heavens open. And he's vindicated as God's blameless son, and God is pleased with him, like God was pleased with Job. Then he's hidden in the earth beside, in burial, and then he's taken to heaven and then to be revealed again. And so the idea is that Jesus is constantly revealing himself. He's hidden in the waters in baptism, which is immersion, obviously. Then he's hidden in the land in burial where no one can see him. And then he's hidden in heaven. And so the book of Revelation is apocalypse, which means an uncovering or revelation. And so the idea is that Jesus is constantly, like they lost him and he's in the temple, and then they discovered him again. And so he just keeps, when he says something and the Pharisees are after him, he hides himself away and then he's back again. So there's this constant unveiling. And then the veil of the temple, no one's supposed to see into the most holy place. The veil of the temple is torn. All these things that were hidden from Israelites, even though they heard, you hear the word and then you see the image, you see the reality. We're supposed to hear and then later we see. The first century martyrs were told there was a better Jerusalem that they hadn't seen, and yet they could see this glorious Jerusalem that wanted to kill them. And they had just had to believe that word. And then they've been persecuted and many fell away, as Paul says in Thessalonians, there'd be great falling away because what they saw didn't match what God had said. And yet in a few short years, God turned the tables and that Jerusalem was wiped off the face of the earth. And then, there was a sign that, the new Jerusalem is now the real one. That's what's revealed in Revelation. The true river. Yeah. So the harlot is old Jerusalem and the bride is the new Jerusalem. So the idea is that there's this below, beside, above, in the waters, in the land, and then in heaven. So Jesus actually reverses that because they'd made idols in heaven and on the land and in the waters. Jesus conquered the waters, then he conquered the land, and then he came and conquered from heaven. And Once again, there's still a future coming when we will see the heaven and earth will be, assuming that that's the case, will be visible to each other. The actual spiritual firmament between the two will be that veil will finally be removed. So I don't know how we got onto that. Sorry, that was me again. You asked a question.
I think that, I got off on that one.
Back to the sons of God. But, I got onto the 2 trees as not the knowledge of good and evil, but the idea was that there was a priestly tree and a kingly tree, and they represented submission to heaven and dominion on earth. So that's the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth, and those 2 trees represented submission to heaven and dominion on earth. And they have to be in that order, whereas all of human history is us trying to seize dominion on earth without submission to heaven. We want to build our kingdoms and we don't want to obey God. But if we obey God, he would give us dominion as a gift. And that's what he did with Jesus. Okay, you've submitted. Here's all the kingdoms of the world. The ones the devil promised to you, but that would have only been on loan until he destroyed them. I'm going to give them to you. Jesus says, now I have all authority in heaven and on earth. So then you have Cain and Abel as the priestly and kingly brothers, Abel and Cain. Abel means mist or cloud, which is heavenly, and Cain is the forge or the spear, which is earthly. It's to do with flesh and blood and the ground and, forging something from the ground, a metal, about a physical battle. As a king, that's what kings do. Kings restrain evil using actual physical weapons. As a priest, your weapons are not carnal weapons, but carnal weapons are necessary as a king, but you need to be a godly king. So a priest king puts those 2 things together. But so the problem with the interpretation of the sons of God being angels in Genesis 6 is they're looking to the book of Enoch and all sorts of other extra biblical stuff for clues, when the clues are in Genesis 1 to 5.
Yeah.
So you have the heaven and earth, and then you have the priestly and kingly trees, heaven and earth trees.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have heaven and earth brothers. Mm-hmm. And then you have two, because Cain was exiled, you have a family tree that splits into two lineages. You have the seventh from Adam on both sides. You have priestly Enoch, who was taken to heaven,
mm-hmm.
and kingly Lamech, who instead of offering sacrifices is all into vengeance. They've rejected atoning sacrifices. If someone hits me, I will kill them. This is all about vengeance. If just as Cain was to be avenged, 70 times, I think. So with Lamech, the vengeance will be 70 times 7. Jesus refers to him when Peter asks him, how many times should I forgive someone? And Jesus says 490 times, which is exactly how many years we're going to be up soon when God was no longer going to forgive Israel. 70 weeks. It's the same deal. We're almost done. And what was going to happen in AD 70? The blood of Abel was going to be avenged.
Wow.
All of the animal, because he was the first human, it was vengeance instead of an animal being killed. The image of God was killed, and it was unjust. He was innocent. So anyway, but the sons of God in Genesis 6 are the priestly line, because they're the ones who submitted to heaven, and then the daughters of men. So the idea is that God splits priesthood and kingdom in order to put them back together. God split Adam in two to construct Eve, then he put them back together in marriage as one flesh. God ripped humanity in half in the sacrifices of Abraham in Genesis 15 in order to put those two halves back together in Christ on the cross. And that's why the Levite priests were bloodied down one side of the body, as the ear, the right thumb, and the right big toe, because the kingly side there was the forbidden tree, in a sense. God split the priests and kings apart, but he did want to put the two halves back together again to intermarry them. And that's why Israel was not permitted to intermarry Gentiles. That's why Abraham didn't allow Isaac to marry a Canaanite. It's why Esau's marriage of two Canaanite women was like Lamech. You're just mixing with the Gentiles again. But the reason is it's not about race. It's about the sacrifices. The sacrifices needed to be protected, because when the sons of God married the daughters of men, and it's all about the fruit of the land and the womb in the Garden of Eden, where God cursed them with limitations. But the sacrifices of Abel, blood sacrifice, mitigated the curse on the womb. And Abel's sacrifice was a substitute for Cain himself as the firstborn. Then Cain's offering was for the fruit of the land. So once again, it's offspring and food. Those are the two things. Those are the things that were promised to Abraham. I'll give you offspring and I'll give you a fertile land. But he gave him a barren womb and a barren land. That's why there's famines. They had to go to Egypt. But Abraham turned those things around by faith. So the barrenness, and then you have that come up again in Ruth, where there's a famine because of all the bloodshed in the end of the book of Judges. God sends a famine when there's the innocent are being killed. So they don't trust him. They go off to Moab, the people who gave them no food in Exodus. And Moab was, what happened with where the Moabites came from. There was, the daughters of Lot who had no husbands and there was no succession, so they got pregnant by their father. They stole the fruit, in a sense, from their father, like Adam in the garden, stealing fruit. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good to look at, like Eve looking at the fruit in the garden. Mm-hmm. They were good. But also the sons of God, the Sethite line, because they were trusting in God for offspring, they would have been the second-class citizens. The kingly line went off. They had all the gifts of music and agriculture and metalwork, etc. A bit like the Philistines later, who Israel had to rely on to get their ironwork done. And the Israelites said, no, I'm only going to do your farming equipment. I'm not going to do your swords. We're going to oppress you. We're not going to give you any power, because they had the talent, they had the skills kingly technology. So the sons of Seth would have become second-class citizens because they were waiting on God, a bit like Abraham waiting on God to make a fertile land. Whereas where does Lot go? He goes to the fertile plain and ends up corrupted. So it's all about impatience. It's Adam stealing the fruit that God was going to give to him as a gift if only he was patient. So what happens? They intermarry, but the outcome of that is there's no priesthood. There's no one mediating between heaven and earth. So what happens? What's in the heavens? The waters above. What's below the earth? The waters below. God puts them back together again. The things that he divided on day 2 to make the firmament, God puts them back together and the earth is destroyed. So the things, as I said, God split priesthood and kingdom in order to put them back together, split Adam into Adam and Eve in order to put them back together, that there might be further fruit. They're more than the sum of their parts, literally. And so God puts the heavens and the earth back together. And I do believe, people say, we've disproven that now, but I do believe there was a water canopy above. We don't know how it works. People say, the earth would have cooked, but we don't know. We weren't there. So the idea was the new creation, the new heavens and earth described in Job 38, where God served as the breaking of the waters of the womb of the primeval world. So the world of Noah, after the world of Adam, was like a new birth that came out of the flood. And so I believe that there was a water canopy, and only the sun, moon, and the five planets would have been visible, 7 stars like the menorah of the original creation. Okay. And that's why you had 7 stars in the lampstand. Jesus has 7 stars in his right hand. That's the lampstand. That's the original creation in a sense. But it's inside the tabernacle, which is dark. It's got no windows, right? So the original creation, you would have only had those 7 rulers. You had the day and night, sun and moon, and then you had the 5 visible planets that actually ascended. They were the ones that moved in relation to everything else. So I believe when it says that the stars rejoice in Job 38, it's because that water canopy was gone, and now we could see all the stars. You couldn't see them before. They were, I should look it up. What's the verse say? But this is my theory. It's all because God always does the one and the many, right? So in the tabernacle, you had 7 stars, the 7 lights of the menorah. How many lights did you have in Solomon's temple? They had 10 lampstands. So they had 70, which is the nations. And so after Noah, you have the 70 nations. So Solomon's temple was like a new heavens and a new earth in that sense, mediating between heaven and earth in a better way. And they also had, in the tabernacle, you had the bronze altar, but then above it, in a sense, you had the bronze laver, which mediated between heaven and earth like the crystal sea. In the temple, they were next to each other, land and sea together, Jews and Gentiles, priesthood and kingdom, now on the same plane together. And in Revelation, Jesus, as the angel of the Lord, is standing on the land and the sea, 1 foot on the land, like the bronze pillar of the priests, and 1 foot on the sea, like the bronze, the Yachin and Boaz. So they're the legs, right, of the tabernacle now. And they're standing on the land and the sea, the Jews and the Gentiles together. So I think, I think Job 38, when it talks about the stars there, that's my theory, is that it's like when the baby is born, the waters break, and then the child is born. And so the world of Noah had a sack around it, and then that was burst, and then the new world came out of that. So the idea was, once again, who's going to inherit? Was it the priestly line or the kingly line? So then God establishes the circumcision. If the sons of God in Genesis 6 are angels, the circumcision makes no sense. God separated humanity into a priestly line and a kingly line, prevented intermarriage temporarily to protect the sacrifices. So that there was, and that's why there's these constant attacks of the devil to co-opt the bride, like stealing Sarah or killing all the males in Egypt, to take the women, or Sennacherib coming like a serpent, and is Zion, the bridal city, wagging her head at him because she's like, no, you can't have me. I'm protected. I'm the bride of God in a sense, and you are not going to impregnate my city walls. That's the picture. And so, because when they would attack a city, they'd storm the gates and then rape the women. But the whole idea was Satan is like, well, I'm going to use the seed of the serpent, and that's in Genesis 6, where you've got the sons of God, the daughters of men. The men are the Adams, and they've become the seed of the serpent. They are now serving him. So the point there is that these men were not, the giants were not supernatural beings. They were natural, like Saul, who was a giant, like everyone else who's mighty in an earthly sense, like Esau, like Nimrod, the hunter as well. They're mighty men, mighty warriors, but because they don't submit to God, their Achilles heel is that they are not going to they're not going to inherit the earth. They are not meek before God, like Moses was, the meekest man who ever lived. If you are meek before God, you are mighty on earth. If you submit to heaven, you will have dominion on earth. Jesus submitted to heaven, and he looked weak, the God nailed to the cross in a sense, and yet then he was given all authority. And so in our lives, holiness makes us seem weak. Our unwillingness to seize power politically makes us seem weak, and yet in the long term, we are strong. Because as a meme I saw recently, sort of, the king says, oh, you guys in the church need to get with the times. And then underneath it says every earthly ruler for the last 2,000 years. The church just keeps coming back, just keeps inheriting the earth. And that's the key in every part of our lives. If we submit to God and are patient, then we refuse to answer our own prayers. In that, it doesn't mean we're not active, but it's the same as why did Western culture become dominant? Because Western culture, to some degree, submitted to God. And then God used Western culture to then judge all of the pagan, bloodthirsty, human-sacrificing, demonic nations around the world. That's not a very popular view at the moment when we talk about colonization. And I'm not saying Western culture was not ever bloodthirsty and greedy and unjust, but God used the West, like Israel conquering Canaan. God used Israel to judge the Canaanites. God used Western culture to judge the first peoples around the world, but also to bring them the gospel. And God would have wiped them out otherwise. Now they've been preserved. But what happened also, God judged Israel for committing the same sins later. He said to them, if you commit the sins of the Canaanites, I will destroy you. What is God doing to the West now? The West is engaged in industrial strength child sacrifice. We have turned from God. We're committing all the sins of the Canaanites. We're basically worse than those pagan nations that we colonized. And now God is going to judge us in the same way. I don't know exactly how he's going to do it. But at the same time, he's going to do it for our good in the long run, because who's going to be left? It'll be the church. But the idea was that there was no priesthood left before the flood. The world was filled with violence and bloodshed, vendettas, and so God wiped them out. And then he set up a miniature world of the land and the sea, which was Jews and Gentiles, so that he wouldn't have to wipe out the actual dry land again until the sacrifices were safe. How were the sacrifices safe? In Revelation, there's a red dragon, which is the Gentiles, but with Herodian power, the Esau dragon, red dragon, just waiting to devour the child when he's born. And the woman is there, who's Zion, the church, the Old Testament church. She's finally given birth to the promised son, but he's rescued and taken to heaven. So in 1 Corinthians, when Paul talks about if an unbelieving spouse, if someone becomes a Christian and they're married to someone and they've got kids, what do we do? And Paul says, there's no longer any covenantal divide as there was with Jew and Gentile. In the book of Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, those who had married pagan women who were not converted and their children were not being raised under the law of Moses and not nurtured in the Lord, they had to annul their marriages. They had to be cut off because that was the sin that Solomon committed, the sin that the Israel intermarrying with the nations. And in Daniel 2, when it says they will the iron and the iron of Rome and the clay, the red clay of the Herods would try and intermarriage, but they wouldn't stick because the law the circumcision was still in play. And then, of course, Jesus set them upon each other and Rome destroyed the Herods. So intermarriage is a big deal. And if you miss the fact that the sons of God were the priestly line intermarrying with the kingly line, in a sense, putting the two trees back together in the same way that we eat the bread, the tree of life, and drink the wine, tree of kingdom, and they are put together in us, intermarried in our bodies as Jesus' body, as the kingdom, the priest king. Paul says you don't have to annul your marriage now because your unbelieving spouse is made holy by you, and your children are holy because you have that influence. But, so when people say, oh, the children were holy, so we should baptize them, I'm like, no. He's actually saying the opposite of what you're saying. He's actually saying that there's now no covenantal divide between Christian and non-Christian in that sense. We're all in the same covenant. So you don't have to, like, your unbelieving spouse is holy. They never want to baptize the unbelieving spouse, do they? I never see that. It's like, well, we baptize the whole household, even the unbelieving adults. They never do that, okay? They're not consistent. If that's what it means, that's what they should do. But what Paul is saying is intermarriage is now no longer a problem. It's unadvisable. Like if a Christian wants to marry a non-Christian, that's going to be a problem. It can cause problems. But if you're in a marriage and one person gets converted, you don't have to annul the marriage. And it's the idea that under the law, if you touch something, it contaminated you. If you touched a leper, then you contaminated. What does Jesus do? When he touches things, he heals them.
Yeah.
And so Paul is saying that in your marriage to a non-believer, your healing touch makes these people holy. It doesn't mean they're saints in the sense that same word is used to describe the saints. It means that they're set apart. You have an influence upon them. So
wow, that's crazy.
My point here is that if you look up all the instances of intermarriage, even in Joshua, where the word just comes up again and again and again.
It really does. If
you get Genesis 6 wrong, you're going to miss that theme and its importance right to the end of the Bible. And Paul the tent maker, stitching Jew and Gentile together to intermarry the two halves again, knit them together. And of course, what is the devil's response? He sets the Jews and the Gentiles together, like Herod and Pilate becoming friends against the church. And that's what you see in Revelation as the land beast and the sea beast. And they're working together. In a sense, they're intermarried against in their hatred of the church. And then Jesus sets them on each other. You know, the Rome becomes the beast that devours the harlot. So, So when it says in Genesis 6:1 that men began to multiply on the earth, that just didn't happen. It's because the kingly line was engaging in polygamy to have more children instead of waiting on God. And yet the priestly line was waiting for, God's opened the womb again. Finally! Isn't that the story of the whole Old Testament where, Sarah is waiting for a son and they work out another way to get around it. And God's like, nah, guys, no, this is exactly what we're not doing. You will wait for the promised son. And then it means that the fact that Noah and his 3 sons each had one wife is significant. Everyone else out there is gaining power, building their dynasty through murder and adultery. Like David, if you want to have power, you have to kill your enemies and their children, any successor to the throne. Game of Thrones, let's kill everybody else off so we can have the Iron Throne, okay? Not saying you should watch Game of Thrones, but that's humanity. If I want to have a dynasty, I have to kill my opponents, but I also have to have lots of children. And the way to do that was to have lots of concubines and lots of wives. And so that's how the men multiplied on the earth in Genesis 6, verse 1, because they were stealing fruit. They were doing things their way. Instead of waiting on God, like Adam for the tree of kingdom, they were seizing kingdom and stealing fruit. So that's why it says the sons of men looked at the daughters of men, sons of God looked at the daughters of men, and they were a delight to the eyes like the fruit in the garden, and they were going to steal that fruit. So that's the point. But the idea too is that if you're a son of God, then there is a sense in which you have to not intermarry with the world. Like Paul says, don't go into a business arrangement, don't make covenants in that sense. You'll be unequally yoked because you have different purposes. A worldly person is just focused on the things of the world and the immediate advantages of what they can get. A saint is going to be doing things that look crazy to the world, things that are not intuitive in the ways of the flesh. And it's, more patient on God, wasting time at church, wasting time reading theology, giving money away, all these things that think, what? And it's because those things are an investment in the future. They will have it's delayed gratification. It's for God's kingdom. And these things seem crazy to the world. So intermarriage still exists in that sense. It's still unwise to marry a non-Christian, but there's not that fleshly divide between Jew and Gentile. And it was a fleshly divide because you had Jewish believers and some Jews didn't believe. You had Gentile unbelievers and Gentile believers. Mm-hmm. They were it's like one of those political charts where you try and work out where you are on the chart, But now instead of being the four quarters where the Jew and Gentile columns and believer or non-believer, the Jew-Gentile division is gone, but the believer-non-believer division still exists. But it's not a social division like circumcision was. It's a spiritual division. And so there's not this idea of we need to set our seed apart with a rite. That's gone. It's finished, fulfilled in Christ. Having that but this is the complete picture. So when people say, what's your thought on baptism? What's your thought on the sons of God? What's your thought on the book of Revelation? These things are all one piece. You can't separate them and say, well, I believe this about this and that about that, because they are so tightly integrated. So in Revelation, it's all about the sacrifice of these first sons of God as physical martyrs who refused to intermarry with the Roman state power as the Herods did. So John's condemnation of Herod for taking his brother's wife, all of these political marriages as well. When Jesus says they'll be eating and drinking fruit of the ground, marrying and giving in marriage fruit of the womb, as it was before the flood. Who's he talking about? He's not talking about angels. He's talking about the ones who are supposed to be the sons of God, who were getting their food and their offspring, but not from God. And he's saying that's what you have done. God promised Abraham that he would eat and drink, and that he'd be a great king. There'd be sons and daughters. And you guys are not waiting on God for these things. And so what does Jesus have? Jesus has got no house to live in. He did growing up. His parents were middle class. They weren't poor. People say they were poor, but they were middle class. And he's relying on everyone for his food, and he's not going to have any offspring. He's become priestly in the sense that he's denied all of those things in order that they might come in a greater way for everybody. He's going to have spiritual children, and he's going to bring a spiritual country, one that will eventually lead to a restored creation. But he's moved the goalposts. He's got the real deal, not just the pictures, the earthly pictures. So it's all one piece. You have to understand it as one piece. If you get off the rails in Genesis 6, there's a lot of stuff you're not going to understand. Even when God split Israel into two, just like the Jews and the Gentiles, Rehoboam tried to, he talked about, using whips on his own people, and he'd be tougher than Solomon was, forced labor, etc. he put them under tyranny, into slavery, and then God split the kingdom into two: the priestly kingdom, which looked after the temple, Judah, and Ephraim, which was like the kingly one. This was a miniature of the Jew-Gentile split, but it was within Israel. And then they tried to intermarry with the Davidic line, and they would have polluted it. So once again, you've got this miniature of the big picture going on where this intermarriage, but God says, no, you guys are not going to be, I'm actually, in Isaiah, I'm going to wipe out Ephraim and the survivors will come to you, but Ephraim has to die. That's the only way there's going to be an intermarriage. And it was Assyria that came as a flood to wipe out the old order. And Jerusalem was flooded up to the neck. It says, you'll be submerged up to the neck. And so Jerusalem behind its walls is going, the breath of life is still there, but you'll just be washed completely. And Sennacherib was held back from actually conquering Jerusalem. But it wasn't until after the Babylonian captivity that the Jews were, that Israel was reunited as Jews, generally speaking. The old divisions were all wiped out, and there was a new, more spiritual Jerusalem that rose from the in Isaiah, when it mentions Cyrus, and it talks about Jerusalem rising again as a land from the waters of the flood, as a new creation in symbolic terms. So it's so totally consistent, working the same thing, working at multiple levels, that if you get one bit wrong, you're off the track. So that's why I get a bit worked up about Genesis 6. People say, well, I think it's angels. I'm like, I'm sorry, but it's like you've built this huge wall of Lego out of white bricks, and you've got one red brick in there, and you're saying, yep, this looks consistent. I'm like, no, look. The Bible's, there's something wrong here. Yeah.
And man, I got so much to say, and you said so much. But even come back from the exile, you see the same intermarriage thing with Nehemiah, and that was in Nehemiah, and that's that's one of the things that was really so convincing. But even when I was reading through when I was teaching through Genesis 6, and with my high school students, and I was having to present the angelic view, there's almost there is no evidence really within the text outside of, which I want to get there, outside of the Nephilim, and outside of having some sort of explanation for having these mighty men, these men of renown. I'm forced to just look at everything preceding, all the context leading up to Genesis 6, and we have Cain and Abel, and then we have the genealogies in Genesis 5. So there's a very clear divide between these two lineages. And then when we come to Genesis 6, the most natural way to see it is we're having the intermarriage of those two lineages. And to insert angel in there, it's like, well, where are the angels, right? And so people typically, they go to Job, they go to Jude, and then they go to the book of Enoch. And that's so out. I mean, I want to get to Jude, and perhaps the book of Enoch as well. But I mean, and of course they go to, Deuteronomy.
You're
32.
assuming, it assumes a lot. I mean, look, Genesis is really, it's so brief in the way it describes things.
It is.
And once again, I think that's partly deliberate, because it forces us to think about what's happening. It doesn't say that these people were engaging in polygamy to have lots of children, but the fact that Noah's Ark had only male and female adults, human and animal, no offspring. Noah's sons were there and their wives, and they were obviously Noah's offspring, but they were all adults. Yeah. And they were all waiting for children. Nobody had any infants. No one had any babies. There was not a single baby of any species on there. And so what were they waiting? They were waiting on the fruit of the womb, and they were waiting on a new earth.
That's so true. And you can think Noah too, he's 500 years old. So that's right. But they're waiting, and then what does God give Noah? He gives him farm promises. He says the seasons, the crops, all of these things. So Noah receives what was initially promised to Adam that got corrupted. He receives the fruit of the womb
and the fruit of the land. And but then of course, then the first snake in the new creation is Ham. Like once again, trying to steal the inheritance, but it's a human snake this time. But I think the mistake with Genesis 5 is thinking that, Genesis 6, I keep saying 5, do I? Anyway, Genesis 6 is, it does talk about the seed of the serpent, but they're not physical seed. The whole point of Satan having to steal the inheritance is he can't have physical seed. He has to hijack someone else's. He has to corrupt human beings and co-opt them as his seed. So when Jesus says to the Pharisees, you are of your father the devil, he's not saying you are the sons of demonic angels.
Yeah, no. He's
saying you are your spiritual character is like that. So the whole idea of these guys, and look, it says when it talks about the Nephilim, I mean, the word comes from Nephal, which means to fall. Literally, they're fallen ones. So the idea is that the serpent said to Adam, God knows you'll become like him. You'll become gods with a small g. So the idea of these Nephilim as fallen ones is that they had, like the Herods who said to Satan, I'm assuming, Jesus rejected the offer of all the kingdoms of the world, and Satan went off to the Herods, and they said, yeah, we'll have it. They became like the mighty men, eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. And so back then, and it says that they were in the land before the intermarriage. If you read beginning of Genesis 6, don't you love this age where we can just type something in and just there it is, Just makes writing theology a lot easier too. The Nephilim were on the earth, on the land in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. And so they were already there. And the idea is, I always wondered why when Israel was too scared, the 10 spies said, we're as grasshoppers before these giants living in Canaan. And the whole idea is that grasshoppers, given the right conditions, they swarm and they grow and they become locusts, and they all affect each other. They just, it's almost miraculous that these puny little grasshoppers suddenly all morph into locusts and just became ravenous and swarm. And that's why they said, we're like grasshoppers before these guys. They're implying that they are like locusts. If we go in there, they will devour us.
We're not.
Giants, human beings, if you're given the right conditions, human beings become giants. I've seen, there's the occasional picture you'll see of people who are very tall. Someone had a photo from 1890 of this English guy who was 1890? Anyway, 1800s. He was in India, and there were 2 royal guards there, Indian guys, with armor. Not a lot of armor, but, they had these interesting helmets, and it was very Indian looking, the culture-wise. They must have been 8.5 foot tall. Like, maybe this guy was quite short, but these 2 guys from, just over a century ago, and they were enormous. And so to say that these giants, these mighty men, the giants are supernatural, and that this lineage survived the flood, which is ridiculous, because there's no mention of them in Genesis 10. And the whole point of having Israel and the Gentiles as a miniature land and sea was to avoid a global catastrophe. It wasn't a local flood. Israel was local. That's the whole point. They're missing the point. That giants arise naturally. Saul was a giant. And yet, was he the son of was he descended from the Anakim? I mean, it mentions Nephilim in Numbers when the spies come back, but it says that this was a slanderous report. In other words, they were lying. And so when Moses repeats this story in Deuteronomy, he mentions the Anakim, but he doesn't mention the Nephilim. So these guys in Numbers, the 10 spies, added the Nephilim to the story to make people afraid. That's my theory. So they weren't actual descendants of the Nephilim, but when Moses mentions it later a few times, he mentions the Anakim. But it's just, if you go back to the land in Abraham's time, the land wasn't fertile. It had famines, right? And he planted oak trees. Oak trees take time to grow. He's patient. He's waiting on God for offspring, and he's waiting on God for these oak trees to grow. Whereas, the kings of the earth always want everything in a hurry. They do it using slavery and robbery. Egypt was going to build itself using slaves. They do it quickly. America was built quickly because they used slave labor, and they're still paying for that. Like, that was a bad move, you know. So they could have rectified it when emancipation came, if they'd given land to the black people, but they didn't. So then they end up long-term paying welfare and having problems. And there's people still milking it. I think it should be over, really, but you know, there's people who are making money out of claiming racism. It's not completely gone, but it's just one of those things where they like conflict. But the idea is that God's people are willing to be patient and to wait for the harvest to come. We wait for God's kingdom to come as a harvest. People who think that we need to take political control and turn a country into a Christian nation by coercion, that's different from legislation. God wants a country to, the kingdom comes as a harvest. Yes, I'm a Christian nationalist in the sense that I think a country should be godly and have godly laws. But if you look at the first Christendom, it was 2 or 3 centuries before Constantine. And then that was the natural progression. God's like, okay, you've been faithful for this long. This is now the harvest. And we now have a godly emperor who wants, you know, he's going to introduce Christian legislation, and it's a natural progression. But if you want to force something, then you're going to end up with a counterfeit. And that's what Satan always offers. You know, take the country, use political force. Christians need to be involved in politics, but if you think that you can turn a population that hates God into a nation that loves God by force, I think we need to be overturning abortion laws and all this kind of stuff, because that's part of the process. But it's not revolutionary. It's not a revolution. That's why Paul was still talking to people who had slaves. He's like, we're going to get rid of slavery by changing people's hearts. That's how we're going to do it, you know. So anyway, yeah, off the track, but you know, the idea of it was Abraham's patience. So when the significance of the grapes of Eshcol was God has now blessed Canaan so much that not only there are giant grapes, there's also giant people. Not all of them were giants, but you know, there's the idea that this place was now so fertile, it's like the world before the flood, when there were, I don't know if you've seen skeletons of these giant sharks and snakes and bears and everything was just oversized, just humongous, giant fish, everything. So the idea that, and we have now in Western culture where conditions are so good that people are generally taller. That's just how it goes. So the fact that the Nephilim were there means that this was natural man at his apex. They were not supernatural. This was natural man with all the brains, and the Philistines were really smart too, and they had giants among them. They weren't idiots. People say, oh, you're Philistine, but they were actually really smart. They were descended from the Egyptians. And they had all the brawn as well. So they were, a bit like, I guess, in America, where you've got the divide between, you know, the sort of the conservatives and the progressives seem to have all the gifts. And yet the progressives are the ones killing all their kids and, you know, or desexing them and borrowing money, all these short-term things. Like they've got all the power because they've seized it now, but they don't realize that that's just going to be ashes in their hands. It's, you know, the conservatism in its true form plans for the future, and that's why it looks unjust sometimes, because it's not seizing things that look good right now. It's waiting for something better later on. Whereas progressivism is, let's do this now, you know, let's buy apartments for all these drug addicts because that'll mean they won't be homeless. You know, things that look good to a child. Policies that are so infantile, and yet they say, well, why don't we want to help? And, you know, the conservative would say, these people who are on the drugs, living on the street, they need to be given a choice of either go to jail or get clean. That's it. That's it. And it's tough love. God is about tough love too. It's merciful. It's just, but it's merciful, because you don't. God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He wants people to change, and so you want to be an enabler in the sense of, I want to enable you to become righteous rather than enable you to continue in your wickedness. But there does come a point where God says, there's no more surgery that can be done. Before the flood, the world was filled with violence. People were. It was what's that movie? The Northman, which is all about Vikings and all that kind of stuff. It's just blood. There's no goodies. Just bloodthirsty culture, vendettas, vengeance. People are acting like beasts. And there's a point where God says there's no more surgery that can be done on this culture. It is now an execution. And the flood was an execution, and a just execution. But again, mercy was offered. Come into the ark. But by that point, people's hearts are so hardened, and the only clue they have of the future is the word of God, and that's all they had. There were no signs. There was Noah building an ark like a madman, or Jesus building a church with many rooms like an ark. When Jesus says, "I go to prepare a place for you," he's a carpenter, obviously, and his house with many rooms is the church we have today. It's congregations all over the world, like the ark, all these little rooms, So obviously there's a place in heaven as well, but this is the new age. This is, so there's a point where to go back to the intermarriage thing as well, now that we've dealt with giants being natural, my son's this much taller than me. I don't know why. It's just how it is. I know a lot of short dads who have tall sons, better food. Maybe it's what they're putting in the food. I don't know. But when Paul says about intermarriage, he says you don't have to annul the marriage. The reason is that the sacrifice no longer needs to be protected. Why is that? Because Christ is in heaven. All right. The sons of God now they can be married to an unbeliever. And I know a few Christians who got converted, but their spouse didn't, and they still have good marriages. They still work it out. There's still a tension there, but they submit to each other in certain ways. They work it out, and hopefully, the converted one wants the other one to become a Christian. But the sacrifice is now safe because Christ has presented his blood, and it's done, and that's why intermarriage is no longer an issue. And it's also, that's why the males in every marriage pictures the reunion between Jew and Gentile in Israel, because the man was like the Jew, he was circumcised, and the woman was like the Gentile, the nations. She's like the many. He's the one, she's the many. Israel was one nation representing many nations. Adam was one, all alone. Eve is the multiplier. She has the offspring. The sons of God were waiting on God, but the Canaanite line were the multipliers, and they did things the wrong way. But then you see in the book of Ruth where Boaz is the Jew and he marries Ruth, the Gentile, who actually becomes part of the Messianic line. She rescues the Messianic line, which is in peril. It's about to be cut off because God killed Naomi's husband and sons, and in judgment, because they didn't trust him for food.
Right.
So Boaz is Israel, and Ruth is from Moab. We know where Moab came from. Once again, that was stealing fruit from Lot. So she's redeemed. So every marriage between, even within Israel, a Jewish man and a Jewish woman, Hebrew man, Hebrew woman, was a picture of the reunion of Jew and Gentile put back together. So intermarriage is the key. It's not angels. It's a spiritual seed of the serpent. And it's a huge theme in Scripture. It makes sense of a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you've made a really strong case, but I do want to address a couple other evidences for the angelic view. So I want to talk about Jude and then just the book of Enoch, because it is so prevalent when defending the angelic view. I feel like we have to address it. So you can take them in any order you want, but in Jude we see language that seems to indicate that there were angels within the context of, like, I think Sodom and Gomorrah, where there's sexual sin, and then these angels are leaving their first abode, which the language can be taken as that they've left their angelic bodies and take on flesh. So can you address Jude and what's going on there if it's not this fallen angel view?
Yeah. Jude actually works through the standard covenant structure. Like he starts with Genesis and he talks about certain people creeping in unnoticed, and and perverting the grace of God, denying our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. He starts off, that's all about Genesis, where the snake comes into the garden. He's actually, Jude is condemning Judaizers. Jude is condemning Jews who rejected Christ. That's the context. Okay. But then, so what he's doing is, he's then, once again, he's using meme warfare. He's quoting all these, he's saying these guys look like brothers because they're Jews, but they are the enemy. They are like Esau. They are actually representing the Herods who were descended from Esau. These guys are only here to steal and destroy like the devil. So they've crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord. So that's the transcendent step of the covenant pattern as well, which starts with there is worship the true God. That's where the Ten Commandments start as well. Every pattern starts with some kind of initiating word, whether it's from God or from his representative. So that's where he starts. Then he takes them into Egypt, Exodus. So Jude's actually working through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. He works through the first 7 books of the Bible. But in the Exodus step, so he mentions them bringing God's people out of the land of Egypt. And he, talks about Joshua, actually, I think, Jesus, yep. And afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And he's saying that modern Jerusalem has become Egypt, and that's why in Revelation it says, "Come out of her, my people."
Yeah.
Leave them behind. This is the city that slew the innocents. Herod has become like Pharaoh. So he gives them that example. Then he talks about the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, and they are now bound. And when it talks about chains, like sacrifices are bound with leather. I think it was with cords because it burns. The whole thing would burn up. And I think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were bound with cords. And when they came out of the fire, the only thing that had been burnt was the cords that bound them. Everything else they were just as they were, Yeah. So Peter, was it Peter that was, or was it Paul? One of them was symbolically bound. The prophet bound him with a cord and said, "You're going to be, taken as a prisoner." But chains, so leather is a priestly binding. Chains are a kingly binding. So the reason that these angels are bound with chains is because they, instead of being servants, they tried to be masters. And that's why I said they'll never have crowns. They'll be bound. They're bound with chains because they're a political prisoner. That's why Satan is bound with a chain in Revelation, because he was a servant who tried to be a master and steal the inheritance. I want to be a son of God. No, you're a servant. Get back to the unseen realm, the kitchen, the stables, the laundry. I know the unseen realm is something that people want to say, well, there's this great, wonderful angelic world behind the scenes with these angelic rulers. I'm like, no. The unseen realm is unseen because that's where the servants work. They're in the kitchen, hidden away. They're in the stables, mucking them out. God's servants are doing things behind the scenes. He's more interested in what's happening in the world, which is why he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about the help. Okay? So, it's Satan's the butler. It's just like, well, and these angels here who did not stay within their own position of authority, that's the idea that they had their stations as servants. Yes, they had authority, but authority to serve, which is always God's. It's always delegated authority. But what did they? They left their proper dwelling. In other words, they exalted themselves. That's what they did. And now what happened? They've been humbled in gloomy darkness. And they're prisoners and this was written just before the binding of Satan, who was their master, who was thrown out of heaven at the ascension. Jesus ascended to heaven, to God's courtroom, and chucked out the accuser because Jesus is the advocate. Where did Satan go? He went from the heavens above to the land beside, and he took up residence in the temple. And that's when it describes in Revelation where he pollutes the springs of water, which is the Garden of Eden, and that's the temple. And it's bitter waters coming out of it as false doctrine. And then thanks to the apostolic witness, he goes from there, which is once again the Exodus 20 thing where it's heavens above, land beside, earth, waters below. So Satan is like kicked out of heaven, he's in the land, and that's when he incites the Jews, and the Judaism itself becomes demonic. That's why Revelation describes it as the ministry of Baal, where they're cutting themselves, but of course they're circumcising themselves, and they're calling down fire from heaven like the priests of Baal, but God's not answering because the fire came down at Pentecost and they rejected this, they blasphemed the Spirit. So, and then what happens, he gets chucked out from, once the temple's destroyed that he took over, then he's chucked down to below, above, beside, below, and he's bound in chains. So he could cause intermarriage between kingdom and priesthood in that order. It's always about seizing power. And that's what happens here. There's no mention of intermarriage. Then Jude moves on to the next example, which is Sodom and Gomorrah and surrounding cities, which is sexual immorality, So, and once again, Sodom and Gomorrah was all about fertility. It was a fertile land, and that's why Lot moved there, because he was impatient, because there wasn't enough food in Canaan for their flocks. So it's actually moving on to the next example. He's not saying that these angels were involved in sexual immorality. It's a different example. He's actually working through. I've got a commentary on John's epistles and Jude, all in one book that works you through this literary structure that Jude's following, and he's actually shifting to the next example. It's actually kind of stepped. So I can see why people might say those two things are resulted, but he's covered Egypt, he's talked about the angels, and now he's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. And they're three separate examples.
To clarify, you're saying that the angels, you're saying that they are in fact angels, but these are angels that had fallen with Satan in the first century. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Oh, well, no, he says that they have been bound. I mean, these are demons, obviously, but there's no mention here of them committing. They did not. I believe Satan's fall was when he tempted Eve. Okay, that was when he fell, and assuming that when he fell, he took others with him. So that was right at the beginning. It wasn't before creation. But so the fall of the angels was not when they married human women and created hybrids. That's just science fiction. Like, it's just really bad fan fiction, because that's not how he works. Satan couldn't kill Job. Satan has no agency in this world outside of corrupting human beings. There's nothing he can do. If someone becomes demon possessed, it's because of human failures. Does that make sense? If these angels came and if these angels took human brides, then angels have agency, and bad angels have agency in this world, but they actually don't. They only have the power that we have given to them, because they are servants, and humanity is designed to be sons. So I think that's the key, that these angels desired to be masters, but that was denied to them. So they did not. If they had taken human wives, they would have become masters, but they didn't. It was denied. So as with Satan, he's desired to be the master, and because he exalted himself, he's been humbled. And that's the point with these things here. It's all about. I think he talks about Egypt, which is all about the priestly people, and then you have the angels. Sorry, the first one, Egypt. The three examples he gives are Egypt, the angels, and Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's all about, Egypt is all about the flesh on the altar. The angels are, Hebrews describes them as fire. And then Sodom and Gomorrah is smoke. So it's the altar,
wow,
the lampstand, and I guess what I'm trying to say is there are 3 steps here. You can't combine the angels with Sodom and Gomorrah because it's the same as when Peter said there'd be blood and fire and smoke in Acts, in his sermon. And the reason is it's sacrificial. There's blood when you cut the animal up and you put it on the altar, and then the holy fire descends from heaven, and then there's smoke, and then God smells the smoke. Okay? So what we have here, we have God saving a people out of Egypt with the Passover. That's blood. Then we have these bad angels who are a false lampstand. That's fire. And where are they kept? Gloomy darkness. It's when your eye is full of darkness. Your whole body is full of darkness. And he talks about the eye being the lamp of the body. And so these angels, instead of being fire, like the ones like bright, Satan claims to be an angel of light or a messenger of enlightenment. These guys are kept in gloomy darkness, so that's the fire. And then Sodom and Gomorrah, that's smoke. That's sulfur. That's just, so what I'm saying is that these are 3 separate steps that he's working through this sacrificial pattern in his, it's all liturgy, as the Bible's always using patterns from Genesis and from, the law. So here, this is flesh, fire, and smoke, but they're 3 separate examples. So if you want to combine 2 of them to try and say that these angels committed sexual immorality, you're actually missing Jude's point in his literary structure.
Yeah, you're missing the So they're saying the context,
because they're weird. Otherwise they don't make sense. Otherwise, why would he mention Egypt, angels, and Sodom and Gomorrah? Why?
No,
it's
I'm
because
following you.
flesh,
Yeah.
fire, smoke. Yeah.
No, I'm following you. But just another. So the context is Judaizers in the 1st century, and you mentioned Satan's fall happening in the garden, and we see wormwood falling in Revelation. Is this a separate fall, and is this how we're supposed to understand the angels here? That it's happening at this time that are.
I think it sounds like, Satan is bound now. Like there's always a head and a body. Like the head is one and the body is many. There's Christ as the head of the church, and the church is a bride, and the bride is many. Adam was one and Eve was one, but Eve can procreate. She's many. She's the only way that Adam could become many. So there's always one and there's many. It's the head and the body. In Leviticus 1, they would offer the head, which was clean, which included the heart and the lungs as heaven and earth, blood, red, earth, and lungs is spirit. So they mediate between the head and between heaven and earth. So they offer the head, which was clean, and then they would offer the body, but the body had to be washed, which is another thing for immersion, okay? The body has to be washed, okay? So as Jesus said, I've washed you guys, now you just need your feet washed, okay? Just upkeep. The idea that Satan was the head, you see that as well in Numbers when everyone's being bitten by fiery serpents, and Moses makes a bronze serpent and puts it on a pole. That's the head. And then because the head's been conquered, that disempowers the body, all the serpents. In the 1st century, Jesus is lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. Who are the snakes? The Pharisees. You guys are a bunch of snakes like your dad.
Yeah.
You are the seed he's saying you are the seed of the serpent.
Yeah.
And so Jesus being lifted up, Jesus conquers the serpent in his legal position as the accuser. But then Jesus' body, the church, has to conquer all the fiery serpents who are the Jews, the Jews who've rejected Christ, who are trying to, and that's why Revelation describes the saints as having heads as lions and tails as serpents, because they themselves are outsmarting the serpent. It's the prophetic tale.
The locust, right? Which is after wormwood. So we have wormwood falling, then we have the locust, right?
Yeah. Well, so the point with wormwood is that Satan's been kicked out. In Zechariah 3, you see the devil in God's court condemning the high priest as being unclean because he's got filthy robes. And because that's the priesthood of Aaron, the lineage of clean has been broken. And Satan's like, well, you can't fix it. Like the corruption, the priesthood's corrupted. It can't be made clean again on earth, because originally it came from heaven, but it's been corrupted. And that's why and Joshua, the high priest, is there. And so God actually has the high priest given clean robes, ceremonially saying, I am now making the priesthood clean again, and it will follow the lineage of Zadok, which they later broke. So, yeah, the idea is that Satan is still in heaven until Christ ascends to heaven, throws him down like lightning as a false Pentecost. Satan comes down as fire from heaven, but then he's the fire from heaven that the unbelieving Jews have called down as priests of Baal. And as Paul says, they're cutting themselves, like they think their circumcision makes them holy. They should go the whole way and emasculate themselves, become eunuchs. But Paul is saying that under the law, if you were a eunuch, you weren't acceptable to God. So he's saying their circumcision has made them unacceptable to God, because they were treating it as holiness. They might as well go the whole way, because they are like the priests of Baal, cutting themselves and throwing themselves on the altar as an acceptable sacrifice. So Satan falls as the answer to their prayers. He comes down as fire onto their flesh, onto their altar. And that's what you see in Revelation 13, where the land beast is a lamb, but it's got the horns of a dragon. It's like, it looks Jewish, but it's actually the devil wearing a mask, a sheep in a dragon in sheep's clothing. And you have the true church described in the 7 trumpets, and then you have these false trumpets, which is the second witness, which is the false church. So you've got the true church described, there's the apostolic church, and then you have its counterfeit described as in Revelation 13, which is the beast, and the number is 666, which is the number of bars of gold that Solomon collected, and that's just a jibe at the Herods, saying, you guys think you're as wise as Solomon, but you've built your house on the sand between the land and the sea, between Jews and Gentiles, and we know what's going to happen to that when the storm comes, and the storm did come. And that's why Jesus said, you will say to this mountain to be cast into the sea. He's like, in Revelation, you see a burning mountain chucked into the sea, and that's the end of Mount Sinai and the law. It's now, Israel's become common again. The law's been removed, and the Jews are now just another nation of the sea. So Satan's cast down after. It's a bit like, when God gave the Spirit to King David, and he took the Spirit from King Saul, and Saul received an evil spirit. And then when David sinned in Psalm 51, he says, don't take your spirit from me. Okay. Like you did Saul. That's what he's implying. I don't want to end up like Saul. I'm repenting. So in the first century, God gives the Spirit to those who waited on him patiently. And then he gives an evil spirit to the Jews who rejected Christ and blasphemed his Spirit. And to blaspheme the Spirit means you disregard the words of the prophets. So when it talks about God sending them strong delusion, their delusion was that they were doing the work of God. And Paul, before his conversion, was one of them. And he was so animated by this hatred that he thought he was doing God's work by murdering the saints. And so, he was an example of the people who had received this strong delusion that they should believe a lie. So the wormwood in Revelation and the water that flows out of the mouth of the serpent that tries to, where does it go? It's soaked up by the land. In other words, all the Jews of the land believe this lie, the ones who didn't believe in Christ. And they believed that Israel was great and God was going to bless the temple. And, and the temple was finished and they thought they were vindicated. But then Satan was basically, Judaism became demonic. That's the point. And in its hatred for, they were the natural brothers. They thought we're the firstborn, we're the true Isaacs. And 1 John is all about teaching the saints to discern between true brothers and false brothers. And that's why he says, if someone is full of hatred, they're not a brother, even though they might be Jewish, because, he's writing mostly to Jews. this is where you need to be discerning between the seed of God and the seed of the serpent.
Mm.
Is this person an Abel or are they a Cain? So Satan was running things in the land until the Jewish war, until the destruction of the temple. And then that was like the Garden of Eden being destroyed in the flood. He no longer had control over the center of operations.
Yeah.
It had become corrupted.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So am I right in understanding that the angels that Jude is referring to had been fallen, but they were just active during that time, as we know that...
Yeah, well, Satan's still active. That's what people say. Satan can't be bound today. But the question is, what is he bound from doing? And James Jordan's great on this. He says, well, Satan's role all the time, including before the flood, is to gather all nations together in rebellion. Because if you're united, you are strong.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole idea of the intermarriage was to be united as one against God and to have all those advantages. It's a bit like the same way that Islam became great, because Islam offered economic advantages because the Arabs were always excellent traders, like gifted with trade. That was their role. There were Jews and there were Christians. The Arabs didn't have a book, so they made one. And but if you joined Islam, it became great because it offered economic advantages. And so that was basically what was offered there. The Tower of Babel was unity in error. Roman Catholicism was unity, but it became unity in error. And that's when it's like, well, okay, we should be one. Yes, and Jesus says, I pray that my people will be one. Unity is strength. When God said at Babel, if they are united, nothing will be withheld from them. He wasn't kidding. So Satan's desire, as he united the Jews and the Romans against the church, even though they were still antagonistic towards each other, they had a common enemy. They realized Christians were a threat to their power. They were united. So Satan is bound from uniting all nations against the church. That's the nature of the chain. Yeah. And so it's, as it says in Revelation 20, as soon as he is released, what does he do? He gathers the nations against the church as like the sand of the sea. Mm-hmm. And so when it says that the demons here are bound in eternal chains, they're not bound from any activity. But as you know, if you have someone who is godly and has God's authority, they can command the demons. Jesus had to beat the devil as the head in the wilderness so that when he came out, he could command the demons of the body. And that's when he starts casting demons out of people. The only reason he had power to cast demons out of people there was because he cut off the head, in a sense, personally. He had to personally defeated the devil. And that's with us. If we practice self-government and submission to God, then and we take power over ourselves, then God gives us power, spiritual power. Holiness leads to power, actual true power. Not like Paul says, power just in words, but actual power. But that's kingdom power, but that starts with priestly submission. And that's what Jesus did. He submitted in the wilderness, and then he started acting like a king, casting out demons. So even though the demons were active, they were bound by his words. So they are under his power. But it's a bit like Israel conquering the land. They still had to be active. God says, I've given them into your hand. They are bound in that sense, but you have to go and subdue them. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's like as you gradually take the land, the beasts will move out as you move in. And I do that so the land doesn't become barren, because if there's no one living there and you haven't taken it yet, the land becomes barren. But he says, if you disobey me, I'll bring the beasts back and they'll devour you. You know, they'll be unleashed in a sense. And that's why Elisha set the bears on the kids. God said, in Leviticus, I'll bring the animals back to devour your offspring. And that was Elisha's threat. You're worshipping a golden calf here in Bethel. Look what's going to happen to your children. I'm unleashing the bears. You know, the beasts are back. And of course, the biggest beasts were Assyria and Babylon. So, I think saying that they're bound they're a bit, as once again Jordan says, they're a bit like a mafia boss who's he's locked up in prison, but he can still pull strings.
Yeah, sure.
You know, he's still got people working for him out in the world. You know, if he wants to get somebody whacked, he just has to pass a message. You know, so so he's severely limited.
Yeah,
that's why the gospel has gone right across the world.
Sure has. Let me ask about. This might be my last question. We'll see. Book of Enoch. So, many people that hold to this angelic view of Genesis 6 will have a high view of the Book of Enoch because, of course, it's very explicit and just spells out the view right out. So, what do you make of the book, and is it any legitimate? Does it grant any legitimacy to the view?
I think it's tricky because we don't really know what its origin is. Some parts of it seem to be very old, but one source that I read said that it didn't reach its current form that we know now until maybe 1st or 2nd century or something. So some of it's one of these things that's sort of grown over the years. But there are some elements in there but even then, when it talks about stuff that happened in Genesis, maybe that's the reason that they say it's old, that it is ancient. But, and I don't doubt that some of it is very old. But to me, it's a bit like in the old, we still use physical currency when it comes to money. But, when they would train bank tellers, they wouldn't allow them to handle counterfeit notes. They would only allow them to handle the real thing, so that when they came across a counterfeit note, they'd pick it straight away. And to me, if you know the Bible and you understand how these themes, these recurring themes are at work in everything that you see, that's the internal logic between this rivalry between priesthood and kingdom versus kingdom, which subdues priesthood. Men taking power on earth and then telling God what to do as a household god, then you'll realize that this stuff can't be true, because it's a bit, I like to say, it's a bit like some of the Roman Catholic stuff they have where, was it Peter and Paul apparently were in Rome and they came across Simon the magician, who I thought had been converted in Acts, I think. But anyway, so he's in Rome and they're both in Rome. And even though we don't really know that Peter went to Rome, here's Simon the magician, and he's such a powerful magician that he's levitating. He's up in the air. And the apostles cast the demon out of him while he's up in the air so that he will fall to his death. And someone was on Twitter, he's actually quite a famous actor, he became Catholic. And he's fairly young, and I think he was involved in drugs and things, and this got him on the path. So good work by the sun's just disappeared here, and I look like I'm a floating head. Either that or the camera's gone bung. I don't know what's happened. Is that any better? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there you go.
That's just creepy. Now I'm glowing. But the idea is, it's a bit like watching the Star Wars sequels and saying, well, it looks like Star Wars and it sounds like Star Wars, but there's just something really wrong here. Like this story is so bad. There's no way this is canon. It's like Adam and Eve covered in fig leaves, pretending to be trees. Yeah. It's just a fake. It's got all the what's the word, accoutrements of Star Wars, but the heart's not there. It's not telling the Star Wars story. Same with the story of Peter and John in Rome casting a demon out of someone so that he'll fall to his death. That's not how they operated. That's not in their character. They would seek to save someone, and then if they refused to repent, they would leave their judgment to God. They only had the power of excommunication. God has the power of execution as the king. Right.
Yeah.
So
well said.
That's how you know that it's a counterfeit note. If you read Enoch and you truly understand the Bible, then you will understand that when you read something, you would say, hang on, this is not canon. This is bad fanfic.
Yeah.
This is fanfic.
Absolutely.
The same kind of stuff that, so when, the stories of Mary's assumption to heaven, if you understand this, the importance of the land and the womb, and not just Mary, but also Sarah and Hannah and Naomi and Ruth, and this idea of God, people waiting for the seed to come, the promised seed, you'll realize that's wrong, because it's actually, you're trying to make sense of Scripture with something that is outside, that is foreign to it, and then that becomes the lens through which you're reading it. It's the same thing with, as I said, I'm against pedobaptism, because the seed has come. Before Abraham, there was no sign upon offspring necessary, because everyone was in the covenant. For good or ill, you're under the blessings or curses based on your faith and obedience. But circumcision was a seed sign, and then that was fulfilled. Jesus fulfilled that by being born, and at the cross he fulfilled the law and removed the law as well. So Abraham and Moses became obsolete in the carnal sense of Israel being set apart. The division of flesh was gone. So every time someone baptizes a baby, they are saying that Christ has not come in the flesh, unwittingly. That's because they've got it wrong. They're trying to make baptism into a divide between Christian and non-Christian that's like the Jew-Gentile divide, when God has removed that. God took down the wall and they're building another one. That wall's gone forever. There's no such division. And so they don't like me saying that, but I like, the seed has come. Jesus grew up. Baptism, he was baptized as a man, because baptism is for men and then for women. There were men at the Passover. There were probably women serving there, but the idea was that the men, like Adam, sacrificed themselves, and then they bring the women in under their wings. So baptism is not for the guarded, it's for the guardians. Baptism is not for the guarded, it's for the guardians. So once again, I'd say that baptism being misunderstood as a revived, better kind of circumcision is a similar kind of fanfic, where you're interpreting the Scriptures based on this lens that you're applying to it of circumcision, and seeing baptism as a circumcision when it's actually about a circumcision of heart. It's the same deal. You're not recognizing the counterfeit because you're not familiar enough with the meaning of the original. So I'd say that with the Book of Enoch, that if you I'm not having a go at anybody, like saying that the sons of God, there are angels. I can see why you would get that wrong, but I think once it's been pointed out that intermarriage is the key here, and that's why circumcision was necessary, and that's why intermarriage is consistently condemned, unless the bride was converted. Joseph had an Egyptian wife. God was fine with that. Moses had a Gentile wife. God was fine with that. And Solomon's first wife, God was fine with that. They were converted. Ruth was obviously converted, and God was fine with that, because it's the whole idea of the Gentiles being brought under the wings. Japheth would come into the tents of Shem. That's the picture. All the nations, Japheth would come under the wings, the priestly wings of Shem. That's the picture in intermarriage. But it puts priesthood first and kingdom second. That's the key here with intermarriage. So I think we should be able to spot the fakes, really. And as we get to know Scripture better and what's actually making it tick, as soon as something, whatever's making the Star Wars sequels tick, it's not the same thing that made the originals tick.
Yeah.
There was that's what makes bad fan fiction bad. It's because it's got all the characters and the plot elements and the styles and I don't know if it's science fiction, the tech and all this kind of stuff. It's got it looks like the original on the outside, but on the inside, the heart's not there.
It's missing, yeah.
So, so the Book of Enoch,
analogy.
it's bad fanfic, and it looks like it was added to over the years, and a bit like a lot of Roman Catholic doctrines that are just, you read them and you think, this is just crazy. Like, where did you get this from?
Yeah.
Where did this idea, but it's not just the fact that it's weird; it's the fact that it's so out of kilter with the original.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like the second Donnie Darko movie.
I've not seen it.
This is
I guess
terrible.
it's a good thing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you just, it's completely foreign from the original story. Anyway, I do want to ask one last question. I'm gonna circle back around to Job, and then we'll end up. But I do want to ask about Behemoth and Leviathan, because there are different ways to view these two creatures. Some people, symbolize and they say this is Satan. Some people say these are dinosaurs. Some people say these are chaos creatures. So I want to get your take on Behemoth and Leviathan.
Yeah. Once again, James Jordan's very enlightening on this. Firstly, God asked Job if he's seen these creatures, so it would seem that they were still around at the time.
Okay.
Because the whole point is that Job asks God a question, and God doesn't answer the question. He describes a whole lot of things in the creation as if to say, the answer has been staring at you the whole time.
Wow.
And so he's saying what it says in Romans 1. Is it Romans 1? Where it says they have, or is it Romans? Anyway, where he says, because of creation, they have no excuse.
Yeah.
The Gentiles, even those who have not heard the word, they have no excuse because the creation testifies of the power of the Godhead. Words to that effect. I think it's Romans 1, around there. Because, Romans 1 does the Gentiles, and I think Romans 2, he starts condemning Jews as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's saying to Job, you have no excuse. Really, like, do I really have to answer this question? Look around you. That you've seen this. I keep saying, I'm getting into it again. You've seen that. There are some things you haven't seen, like the treasures of the snow, which he's talking about snowflakes, things like this. But he's saying that the evidence was in front of your eyes the whole time, and you should have made the link that that God is not unjust. God has not lost control. All of these things are his character. That's what it says in Romans. His character is made evident in what we see in the world, and also in the image of God in human beings. We know about the Father and the Son because we have fathers and sons. We understand the church as God's people, as a bride, because we understand mothers and daughters. Daughter Israel, daughter Zion, all the way through Isaiah. It's not daughters of Zion, it's daughter Zion. She's the bride. And she's kept, was keeping her chaste. And in Revelation, the great harlot is Jerusalem. But the new Jerusalem above is the bride. So we understand the things that are unseen by the things that are seen. That's what he's saying to Job. So Job saw these dinosaurs. There's an article, I think it's on creation.com, but there's a few other places where they say that it's possible and likely that Leviathan was a Sarcosuchus, I think it's called, but its nickname is Super Croc, and it's this gigantic crocodile. When we're talking about gigantic animals before these things were still around. They lived along the Nile. Apparently, they lived on riverbanks, but like crocodiles do. But this thing, when it opened its jaws, like the top of its nose was about 8 feet off the ground. Like it was just humongous. It would swallow a human being whole. And because it's got this big kind of tank in the front of its nose. The theory is that its nose was a bit like the back end of a bombardier beetle, where it would mix chemicals together and breathe fire. So there were actually fire-breathing dragons. That's the theory, that God created these things that could actually mix chemicals and breathe fire. And the bombardier beetle is the only living example we have of a creature that can still do that to defend itself, but actually create explosives. So Behemoth with its tail like a cedar, it's probably a brontosaurus or something like that.
Yeah.
And look, this as people will say, there's medieval carvings of dinosaurs. They're all over the world. There are reports of creatures coming up right up to the 19th some even this 20th century. We don't know how many of those are true, but when American Indians who have the mythical Thunderbird describe the reason they believe in the Thunderbird is because they saw a gigantic bird with a wingspan of something crazy getting hit by lightning, which they then discovered a few days later as they traveled, and their description of it was a pterodactyl. Why would they lie? There are carvings of these things in America. What was the other one? Oh, Australian Aborigines describing a creature that became known as a bunyip. What they described is a duck-billed dinosaur. Now, you know, all the stories we have of people slaying dragons, etc., Chinese dragons, all this stuff around the world, it's likely that there were still dinosaurs around, and now we've got them digging up dinosaur remains that still stink and still have squishy flesh in a lot of cases. They're not fossilized. They're not millions of years old. So yeah, I'd say that the dinosaurs there are actual dinosaurs. However, the book starts with a serpent, which is the devil, and it ends with dinosaurs, dragons. Isn't that what always happens? God starts you off with the serpent. If you don't defeat the serpent's lie, then he turns into a dragon like Cain, who devours flesh, and then eventually that's in the land. So garden, land, world, serpent, dragon, beast from the sea, like some giant hydra thing, which is what happens in Revelation. So if you don't deal with the lie, then the false ideology starts to murder people, which is what always happens. Say with communism starts as a lie, then it becomes tyrannical and starts killing people. Then it becomes globalism, which is a beast, multi-headed beast. But you have to defeat the lie. That's the whole key. That's what Jesus does in Revelation. He judges the 7 churches as sons of God and says, deal with these lies in your churches. If you don't, look at the harlot, look at the red dragon devouring the flesh, and now look at the beast in the world that's rising from the sea that Satan brings up with Jews and Gentiles working together, nations united against the church. So serpent, dragon, beast, multi-headed hydra. At the end of Job, God describes Leviathan as a pet. He says, look, I put a hook in his nose and I take him around like on a leash. In other words, however bad things seem to get, however bad the beast is, he's my servant. This false angel at the start of the book is God's servant. He's doing God's will, even though he doesn't like to. In Deuteronomy, where is it? 32. God says, I'll bring the Gentiles against you, but he says they won't know that they're doing my will in disciplining you.
Yeah.
In Isaiah, he says, I'm going to judge you, and he gives 4 strokes, and at the end of each stroke he says, but my arm is stretched out still. Then I'm going to do this, and my arm is stretched out. It's like he's chopping a tree down or cutting with a sword. I'm still cutting away. And then he says, I'm going to deal with Assyria. Assyria is my axe. But is the axe the master?
Yeah.
Is the rod the one that lifts itself up to discipline? No, I'm going to deal with him. And he doesn't know that he has his plans, but he doesn't know that I'm just using him as a tool. But I think what we have to learn is, unlike all good tradesmen, Satan doesn't look after his tools. You know, God deals with them. So, yeah, I think that's the reason. That's the reason why there's dinosaurs at the end of dragons. That's what they are at the end of Job. And it's funny. One of the dragons is priestly and one of them is kingly. You know, Leviathan breathes fire, and he's the one that he lives in the sea and churns it all up. So he's like the Gentile one. And the land, that's the sea beast and the land beast.
Yeah.
There you go. Yep. And the other one eats vegetation. But you know, the stories of the tribes in Africa, people have gone looking for it, but they do report these long-necked dinosaurs that live there. And they said, but it's interesting because, you know, the skeletons we have don't have these beasts, the natives described as having a frill, like a fin on the top, you know, like on the top of their head, which you don't find in the fossils because it's gone. But they described them as having this, and they said, "Yeah, look, we've seen these beasts. They will attack you, but they won't eat you. They're vegetarian." And so that's the idea of the priestly. The priestly beast in Job is a vegetarian that eats vegetables, and but the kingly beast will eat flesh, just like in Daniel, where he says, "No, we're going to eat priestly food," and they just ate seeds, false vegetables. But then when God has vindicated us, then we will eat meat like kings. Yeah. In Genesis, Adam and everyone up until the flood was only supposed to eat, where they were all vegetarians. I believe the Canaanites were eating meat early. I think they grabbed the food early. And so we eat meat as judges. Judges devour flesh. So when people want to be, vegetarian or vegan, it's like, no. The world we live in now, not only do we need to eat meat, not overly, but we need some. It's an image of our role in the world now. Yeah. And of course the church is like Esther, who calls for a big feast, and the church is now devouring the nations, but by giving them life, in a sense, as we eat Christ. Yeah. Anyway, so that's the food theology. That's another question. But so the idea of priest kingdom is at the end of Job as well, where you have, the kingly attributes in Leviathan given back to Job, and the priestly ones as well. That's but I think the point is, even in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which people say talks about Russia invading Israel, it's actually predicting the events in the book of Esther. And it talks about Haman, who has a wicked plan, and God putting a hook in his nose. And once again, Haman's just a servant. He's the one that calls for the destruction of the Jews. And God is like, no, I'm just going to use you so that I can give a bigger inheritance to my kids. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole story of the Bible. Yeah. Satan must hate this podcast, hearing that again. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's there in his cell, chained up, pulling strings, trying to get notes out to deceive people and having some success. And God is just, Satan, you are just a tool. I'm sorry. You're just, whatever you do, even when you have my son crucified on the cross, you've just blown it. You couldn't resist the temptation. There's the fruit on the tree, and you knew what was going to happen. You've been warned for 4,000 years. You couldn't help yourself. Yeah. And look what happened.
There you go. Oh, man. I love that. Yeah. That's awesome. Okay. Awesome. Well, we'll end on that note, man. We ended up going long again. I'm not mad at it, but I am tired.
That's okay. We've got two bookends now. We've got two long podcasts and they match, so that's okay.
Yeah. No, I'm good. We got into a lot. I'm very pleased with that. So anyway, thanks again for coming on.
Do you remember when I said the other day we probably wouldn't have enough to talk about?
Yeah. And here we are. I knew that wouldn't be the case. All right, man. Well, I'll invite you to have any closing words, and again, thank you, and I'll have you close us out in prayer.
Yep, cool. All right. Firstly, I'll just say my website is www.biblematrix.com.au. There's a link there at the top to Theo magazine, which has articles on this. There's 8 editions, and the last one has something on the sons of God. Yeah, if you're interested. But there's heaps of stuff there. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. Thank you that even though there is bread for children, all the basics, once again, thanking you for that, but also that there is wine, that something that takes a lot of wisdom and contemplation and patience to master, that it stretches us, but it is there to make us wise, to make us mature and perfect, and that anything that causes conflict between brothers over doctrine is there in the long term to bring greater peace and a greater inheritance. All you desire for us is to bless us, and your gifts often come in disguise. You often give us stones and serpents, as you did with the tablets of the law and the serpents in the wilderness. and by faith we are to turn them into bread and fish, dominion over the land and the sea. We thank you that you're a great Father, and we just pray that your Spirit would guide us into all truth, into greater truth, but also help us to remember to submit to you, that holiness is power, that submission and self-government is the path to glory. We thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with somebody you know. And with that being said, we'll catch you on the next one.